Welcome, sleepy summoner. Hope you've been well. Get comfortable and ready to learn about Sylas, the boy of Dregbourne. Chapter 1. The Boy of Dregbourne. The night is quiet, and in the hush of this moment I invite you to drift back to the cobbled streets of a kingdom that prided itself on order and tradition. Demacia, with its high walls and marble halls, hid beneath its grandeur a network of alleys and tenements where the poor huddled together for warmth. In that maze of shadows lived a boy named Sylas. He was born to labourers who believed, as so many did, that obedience to the throne would keep them safe. His mother whispered hymns of loyalty to him, while his father hauled stone and timber for the palaces overhead. They could not have known that their son carried within him a gift the kingdom feared more than any invading army. As he grew, he felt the pulse of unseen currents beneath the surface of things. When the blacksmith worked his forge, Sylas could sense the embers flickering in ways that did not match the movements of his hands. When an itinerant healer passed through the district, he sensed an energy hidden under her cloak, as if stars had been woven into fabric. These sensations were subtle at first, a warmth in the air, a flutter in his chest, but they set him apart from his peers, who laughed at his distractions and odd preoccupations. Even as a child, he knew he carried something other than hunger in his belly. Demacia taught its citizens to see magic as a sickness, yet it was a sickness that appeared to strike only those outside the golden circle of privilege. The boy listened when the elders spoke of the scourge, of sorcerers who could tear stones from the earth with a gesture, and he felt fear twist his own stomach. He looked at his hands and wondered if they could betray him. His parents, ever dutiful, took notice of their son's unusual sensitivity. Their eyes betrayed a sadness that the boy could not fully understand, a pity mixed with pride. They had been taught that to harbour magic was to harbour treason, yet the kingdom also promised mercy for those who turned themselves in. So with love that was tangled with doctrine, they convinced their son to present himself before the authority known as the mage seekers. He walked between them, up the long staircases of white stone, past the statues of knights and kings who stared blindly into the distance. Behind heavy doors he met the man who would change his life, a senior seeker with cold eyes that examined him like a tool. The boy felt something then, an absence where the seeker stood. It was as though the man was a hollow vessel, his voice heavy with authority, but devoid of the warmth and resonance that Sylas associated with life. The seeker asked him to describe what he felt. Sylas, in his innocence, told the truth. He spoke of how certain people seemed to hum and crackle with hidden power. He described the way his skin tingled near those who wore fine clothes or carried books bound with runes. The seeker listened, and a smile that did not reach his eyes slid across his face. Here was a useful instrument, a boy from the Undercity who could root out magic where the laws forbade it. The seeker offered him a role. Instead of being cast out or confined, Sylas could serve the kingdom by using his unusual sense to identify those who threatened the safety of Demacia. To a boy from hunger and shadow, the promise of purpose was intoxicating. He saw possibility in the proposition, a way to step beyond the grime of Dregbourne and become part of something greater. He agreed, and his parents wept with relief and pride, though their tears held a strain of sorrow. In those early days, Sylas strode through market squares and manor houses, under the watchful eyes of the mage seekers. He learned to read the currents that curled around people's hearts. Some magics were faint, a gentle glow that could be confused with the heat of summer sun. Others blazed like bonfires hidden under linen and velvet. He pointed them out, and the seekers swept in with chains and masks, dragging away neighbors and strangers alike. He did not think deeply about the fate of those he exposed. He was praised for his service and fed on the gratitude of his handlers. Yet even then, there were moments that unsettled him. He would stand in a noble's parlor and sense a vibrant coiled power within the lady of the house, but the seekers ignored his quiet warning. He would pass a merchant shouting about the danger of witches and feel the steady pulse of magic within the man's chest. The hypocrisy gnawed at him. How could magic be a curse when so many in high places radiated the energy he had been taught to fear? He began to understand that the law was not applied evenly, that some were allowed to harbor magic beneath their rings and robes because of their birth, while others were cast into darkness for a spark they never wished to bear. These realizations marked the first cracks in his belief. At night, he would lay on his narrow cot and listen to the wind whistle through the gaps in the walls. He imagined the voices of those taken, their cries echoing down stone corridors he had never seen. He thought of his own parents and wondered if he had condemned others like him. Slowly, the pride he felt in being useful turned to shame. Yet he continued his work, trapped by his sense of duty and by the subtle threats of the seekers who reminded him that his freedom depended on his compliance. His youthful sense of belonging eroded, and in its place grew a numbness, a quiet resignation to the role he had accepted. The seeds of rebellion were buried in him, but they had not yet sprouted. He was still a boy, and his world was bounded by the narrow lanes of his upbringing. Sleep eludes him, sleepy summoner, as he lies in that cramped bed, wrestling with feelings too large for his small frame. Outside, the street lamps flicker, and the chill of Demacian night creeps in. But within the Shurish boy, a fire starts to smolder, faint and persistent. Throughout those early years, Sylas remained isolated. His handlers kept him from other children, fearful that conversation might lead to questions. He was allowed to speak only with his assigned mentors, men who offered instruction laced with condescension. When he walked the halls of the Mage Seeker compound, he passed other servants and aspirants who averted their eyes, as though contact might contaminate them. This loneliness etched itself into his bones. He longed for the touch of friendship, for someone to look at him and see more than a tool. Sometimes he would find solace in watching the birds that perched on the rooftops. They seemed free in a way that people were not, flitting across the sky, subject only to the wind's whim. He envied them, the ease with which they moved between light and shadow. On rare occasions, when his duties took him outside the city walls, he would slow his steps to feel the earth beneath him unpaved, to smell the grass crushed under his boots. In these small moments, he felt connected to something beyond the strict lines of Demacian law. He could almost forget the chains the city placed on all who lived within its embrace. Those memories would later become lifelines when he faced the darkest corners of human cruelty. Thus, the foundation of his story was laid. A child of Dregbourne, gifted with a sight that bound him to a system built on hypocrisy. In that tension between service and suspicion, he began to feel the weight of the chains that would soon close around his wrists. The boy, could not yet see the scope of his future, but the world around him was already shaping the man he would become. This is where we leave him for now, sleepy summoner, standing in the slanting light that falls between tenement roofs, sensing the currents of magic that he can name but not yet comprehend. The wind whispers through the alley, carrying with it the faint scent of jasmine and coal. The boy breathes it in, unaware that his path is leading him toward a fate that will both bind and free him in ways he cannot yet imagine. Chapter 2. Doubt in Service. Time moved in slow currents for the young man who lived between worlds. Sylas, no longer a child, had grown into a wiry youth whose senses were attuned to the hum of hidden power. He woke early, as the first light turned the eastern sky a soft lavender, and he reported to his handlers with the obedience of someone who knew that even a moment of hesitation could be used against him. The days were a rotation of visits to homes and shops, temples and taverns. He would be ushered into rooms heavy with the scent of incense or roasting meat, and he would inhale deeply, seeking that tingle that signaled the presence of magic. Sometimes his role was simple. He would nod toward a servant girl carrying a tray, and the mage seekers would descend upon her, binding her hands and muffling her screams. At other times, he found himself pointing toward individuals who wore the crest of noble houses, men with broad shoulders and women with elaborate hairstyles. He watched as the seekers hesitated, murmured among themselves, and then chose inaction. They would tell him later that he must have been mistaken, that his vision was clouded. He learned that truth in Demacia was a flexible thing, bent to accommodate the comfort of those in power. The hypocrisy gnawed at him. Each time he sensed magic left unchecked in the halls of privilege, his belief in the justice of his work eroded. It was not that he wished for the noble to be dragged away. He wished, rather, for consistency, for honesty, for a recognition that the kingdom's laws were not as righteous as they were proclaimed to be. He started to pay attention to the faces of those taken from the lower quarters. A baker's wife, her hands still dusted with flour. A shepherd with calloused palms. A young man with fear bright in his eyes. He wondered who they were beyond the label of mage. He wondered what had become of them after they disappeared through the iron doors of the Mage Seeker compound. In the evenings, when he sat alone in his small room, he replayed those encounters. He heard their voices, their pleas for mercy, and his heart tightened. The stone walls of his cell, though not yet a prison in name, began to feel confining. He would rub his wrists, feeling phantom shackles that had not yet closed, but were drawing nearer with each passing day. There were moments when the mask he wore slipped. Once, while in the grand hall of a lord who loudly proclaimed his hatred for sorcerers, Sylas sensed the unmistakable glow of magic from a ring on the man's finger. It pulsed with suppressed power, as if it contained a storm in miniature. Sylas pointed, eyes wide with alarm, but his handler squeezed his arm sharply, a warning to be silent. After the visit, when they were alone, the handler whispered that certain things were beyond his concern. The Lord was important, a patron of the crown. In that instant, Sylas understood more than any lecture could have taught him. The law was a net cast selectively, catching only those who could not buy their way free. The kingdom's vaunted order was maintained not through fairness, but through fear and convenience. He turned this realization over and over in his mind like a coin, feeling its edges and weight. It hurt, but it also clarified his growing sense of injustice. The world he served was not the world he had been promised. In his free moments, he sought knowledge wherever he could find it. Books were scarce among the Undercity, but the compound housed shelves of volumes seized from those labelled heretics. He would steal glances at their spines and titles, memorizing names of thinkers and historians. On rare occasions, a sympathetic guard would allow him to borrow a text for an hour. Sylas devoured these words, reading by the dim light of a single candle. He learned of the founding of Demacia, of the ice wars with Noxus, of the forging of the petricite walls that lined the capital. More importantly, he learned that magic, in many lands, was not feared but celebrated. He read of Ionian poets who wove spells into music, and of Shuriman priests who called down rain upon deserts. These stories ignited a longing within him, a curiosity about a world where his gift would not make him a monster. He clung to these tales as proof that the narrowness of Demacia was not universal. Though he could not yet act upon this knowledge, it began to reshape his sense of self. He was not merely an afflicted boy. He was part of a larger tapestry of power and possibility. The weight of his role intensified when he encountered people who did not beg for mercy. There were those who looked at him with calm resignation, who seemed almost relieved to be discovered. They would meet his eyes and nod, as if acknowledging a secret between them. In those moments, Sylas felt seen. He realized that some accepted their fate not because they believed in the justice of it, but because they were weary of hiding. He wondered how long he could endure such concealment if he were forced into it. He wondered how many times he would have to betray others before he could no longer recognize himself. Each question added a layer to his internal conflict, a layering of guilt and confusion that made him restless. He began to wander at night, slipping through alleys to gaze up at the stars. He would stand in the shadow of the palace and imagine a life beyond those walls. He had never been farther than the outskirts of Demacia, yet his mind roamed across the map. He pictured mountains capped with snow and oceans that stretched beyond sight. These imaginings offered comfort and an outlet for his growing discomfort. One particular day, the dissonance became too sharp to ignore. The mage seekers had received a report of a mage living among a rural community to the south. Sylas travelled with a small contingent, their horses kicking up dust along the road. They arrived in a village where chickens scratched at the dirt and children played games with sticks and stones. The suspected mage was a woman with hair streaked with grey. She was not hiding behind gilded gates. She lived in a modest cottage and was known to have healed the sick and eased childbirth. When Sylas approached, he sensed the magic within her. It was gentle, like a stream rather than a roaring river. She did not run. She placed herself between the seekers and a young girl who clung to her skirts. Sylas looked at the child, her eyes wide with trust and fear. He felt something then, a protective instinct he did not expect. He thought of his own childhood, of his mother's embrace. When he reached out to gently move the child away, the back of his hand brushed the woman's skin. A surge rushed through him, heat and light coursing up his arm, across his shoulders, into his chest. It was not like the tingles he had felt before. This was raw, wild, and unrestrained. It erupted from his fingertips without his control, arcing outward in violent bursts. The force of the release knocked the closest seeker backward, his eyes wide in shock. The magic drawn through the boy did not dissipate. It shot forth in a wave that struck his mentor squarely in the chest. The man collapsed, the life gone from him before he hit the ground. The woman screamed, the girl screamed, and the magic burned like fire inside Sylas. He had not known he could channel what he sensed. He had not been taught that petricite could not only dampen but absorb. In an instant, 3 lives ended, his mentors, the healers, and the child's, taken by a power he could neither contain nor comprehend. The world tilted. Dust swirled around him, and the bodies on the ground were like broken dolls. Sylas stood frozen, his hands trembling. He could hear his own heartbeat thunder in his ears. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked, oblivious to the tragedy unfolding. The other seekers stared at him with a mixture of horror and fury. In their eyes he saw his own condemnation. The hypocrisy he had quietly despised turned upon him. He was branded a murderer, not because he had intentionally struck, but because he had been a conduit for the very magic he had been used to suppress. The guilt that followed was a tidal wave. In the aftermath, as the villagers mourned and the seekers tightened ropes around his wrists, Sylas' mind replayed the moment repeatedly. He felt the heat, heard the screams, saw the fall. He told himself he had only tried to protect the child, yet his attempt at compassion had led to catastrophe. This paradox, his intent versus the outcome, gnawed at him. As they dragged him away, he looked back at the bodies, at the dust settling on still limbs, and an ache lodged itself in his throat. It was his awakening, both to his own capacity to unleash magic and to the cruelty of the system that would offer him no understanding. That night, lying on the hard floor of a holding cell, he stared at the ceiling, tracing cracks in the stone. His future stretched before him like one of those cracks, dark, narrow, inevitable. He did not yet know that this incident would shatter the fragile structure of his life. For now, he could only close his eyes and surrender to a sleep troubled by visions of what had been lost. In the stillness of that cell, with the distant echo of dripping water, the seeds of rebellion were no longer dormant. They began to stir, to press against the soil of his soul. And you, sleepy summoner, may feel the heavy sorrow that settled upon him as he drifted into uneasy dreams. Chapter 3. Darkness and Knowledge. They did not spare him. The mage seekers, once his colleagues, now bore the expression of men who could not wait to rid themselves of a traitor. Sylas was marched through the streets, not with the quiet courtesy afforded to noble defendants, but with a rope around his neck and chains around his wrists. People leaned out of windows to watch. Some spat curses, others whispered prayers, and a few simply stared. He was led to the very compound where he had served and dragged past the offices and training rooms to a stairwell that spiraled down into the earth. The air grew colder with each step, the stones slick with moisture. Torches cast trembling light upon walls carved centuries before. At the bottom awaited a heavy door of iron and petrified wood. Beyond it lay the oubliette reserved for those considered particularly dangerous. Sylas was shoved inside. The door clanged shut behind him, sealing away the last sliver of daylight he would see for many years. His cell was more a pit than a room. The ceiling arched low, forcing him to stoop. Walls of rough stone bled dampness that pooled on the floor. Heavy manacles of petricite hung from a ring set into the wall. The chains were thick and cold, their weight meant to remind the wearer of his status at every movement. When they clasped around his wrists, he felt a numbness spread. The petricite drank the ambient magic around him, dulling his senses. The humming currents he had lived with since childhood became a faint whisper. For the first time in his life he was alone with his own thoughts. There were no voices of handlers instructing him, no cries of the accused, no bustle of the market. Only the drip of water and the scrape of rats. Days blurred into nights without distinction. The only measure of time was the arrival of thin meals slid through a small hatch in the door. He counted them at first, but eventually lost track. Hunger gnawed at him, but it was the isolation that ate more deeply. In that darkness, memories and regrets looped endlessly. He saw the faces of those he had condemned, the fear in their eyes as he pointed toward them. He heard the crack of the woman's voice as she begged him not to kill her. He felt the heat of the magic that had coursed through him, a warmth that seemed to mock him with the possibility of freedom. Without external stimuli, his mind wandered far. He recalled his mother's songs, the smell of bread baking in the communal ovens, the way sunlight had filtered through cracks in the boarding above their bed. These recollections were both solace and torment. They reminded him of what he had lost, but also of what still existed somewhere above him. He imagined his parents growing old, his father's hands still calloused from work, his mother's hair silvering. Did they know where he was? Did they blame him for his crimes? At times, he whispered apologies into the darkness, as if his words might seep through stone and reach their ears. The petricite shackles were designed to suppress magic, but they could not suppress curiosity. Sylas began to observe his chains with an intensity born of desperation. He noticed the faint veins within the stone, the subtle variations in color. When he moved his wrists, the links made different sounds depending on the angle. He remembered hearing, in passing, that the walls of Demacia were constructed from the same material. The stone not only dampened magic, but absorbed it. Days turned into months, and he contemplated this property. If the petricite absorbed energy, what happened to that energy? Did it dissipate? Was it stored? If it was stored, could it be released? These questions became his companions. He had always been perceptive, able to sense magic in others. Now, deprived of those sensations, he turned his focus inward, feeling for any echo of the power that had once surged through him. He pressed his palms against the stone, and in his mind, imagined the energy bound within. He pictured it like water trapped behind a dam. Time in isolation is fluid, yet at some point, a glimmer of hope flickered in the gloom. A young woman, wearing the robes of the illuminators, a charitable religious order, appeared outside his cell. Her name was Luxana, though she would ask him to call her Lux. She was the daughter of one of Demacia's most influential families, yet she spoke to him with a gentleness that surprised him. At first, he distrusted her presence, thinking she had come to mock him. But Lux did not hurl insults. She brought books, heavy tomes that she slid under the door, and she asked questions about his life. Sylas, starved for conversation, responded cautiously. He recognized something within her, a warmth that pulsed like the magic he used to sense in others. She tried to hide it, but he saw it, even through the dampening effect of the petricite. Over months, They formed an unlikely bond. He told her tales of the Undercity and of his work. She listened, her eyes bright with curiosity. In return, she described the world above, the celebrations, the festivals, the politics that swirled around the court. Her voice painted pictures in his mind, broadening the confines of his cell. Lux also smuggled him knowledge. Books became his escape. He read about philosophy, about nations beyond Demacia, about the structure of magic and theories of how it interacted with matter. One day, she brought him a treatise by the sculptor Durand, the man who had shaped much of Demacia's defences. Durand's writings on petricite were meticulous. As Sylas read, his heart quickened. The stone did not simply neutralize magic, it absorbed it. That absorption was an act of storage. If the right pressure could be applied, the stored energy might be released. His mind buzzed with possibilities. He felt, for the first time since his imprisonment, a sense of control flickering at the edges of his despair. He shared his thoughts with Lux, testing her reaction. She listened, fascinated and horrified. He could see her struggle between compassion and fear. Though she had been raised to believe magic was dangerous, her own powers, hidden and uncontrolled, contradicted that teaching. They bonded over that shared burden. In those moments, the stone walls seemed thinner, the dampness less biting. Years passed in this pattern, isolation punctuated by visits, knowledge gained in secret, and a growing certainty that the system that confined him was built on lies. Sylas' body hardened from deprivation, but his mind sharpened. He practiced focusing his will, pressing it against the petricite, feeling for any give. He imagined the stored magic as a slow river pushing against a sluice. He recalled the surge he had once felt when touching the healer, and how it had flowed through him and out. If he could replicate that, not with a person, but with the stone itself, he might create an opening. The thought became an obsession. At night, after Lux had gone and the darkness settled again, he whispered to himself, going over the steps in his head. He was cautious. Impatience could mean the difference between release and death. All the while, he remained careful with Lux. He did not wish to betray her trust. Her visits had become the only warmth in his world. Through her, he kept track of time. 15 winters came and went. Outside, kings died and heirs rose. Inside, a single man clung to dreams of freedom. As he waited, his anger cooled and hardened, like metal in a forge. It was no longer a wild blaze, but a steady heat, ready to be directed when opportunity arose. Chapter 4. The Spark of Escape. When change came, it arrived not through careful planning, but through a confluence of desperation and chance. Word reached Lux's family that she had been visiting a condemned mage. The Crown Guard clan, stern and proud, confronted her. Fearful of what this could mean for her, she stopped coming. Days turned to weeks without the soft murmur of her voice or the slide of parchment under the cell door. Sylas felt her absence like a physical pain. His mind, always turning, considered that his time might be running out. Without her, his access to knowledge and the outside world had been severed. He tested his chains more aggressively, feeling for the pocket of stored magic he was certain lay within. He tapped the cuffs, counted the beats between his taps and the faint vibrations that responded, seeking patterns. He remembered the surge from years before, the channeling of the healer's energy. He knew he needed a source to unlock the petricite, something potent enough to flood the stone and overwhelm its dampening. Soon after Luck's visits ceased, guards came to his cell in greater numbers. They dragged him upstairs into blinding sunlight. The sudden brightness seared his eyes after years in gloom. He was taken to a courtyard where a crowd had gathered. At the center stood a raised scaffold. The headsman awaited with a sword that glinted in the sun. The murmurs of the crowd filled his ears, blending into a dull roar. He was to be executed, not quietly in the pit but publicly, as a spectacle. He scanned the faces before him, and across the sea of bodies he saw her Luxana, her hands bound, her eyes wide with terror. Her family had learned of her visits and imprisoned her, yet she had come to plead for his life. She stood beneath the scaffold, calling out, her voice trembling. Her words were lost in the clamor, but he could see the desperation on her face. The headsman placed a hand on his shoulder, guiding him toward the block. Sylas' mind raced. The petricite shackles around his wrists felt heavier than ever. He knew this was his only chance. He needed her magic. He needed contact. As the headsman raised the sword, Sylas lunged toward Lux, his chains clanging. Guards reached to restrain him, but their hands slipped on the slick surface of his restraints. He fell forward, his outstretched fingers brushing her arm. In that instant, a torrent of light and heat rushed into him. It was like nothing he had ever felt. Lux's magic was luminous, effervescent, a cascade of pure brilliance. It slammed against the petricite, and he focused, guiding it toward the cuffs with all the intent he could muster. The stone drank deeply, swelling with power. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then the shackles cracked. Lines like spiderwebs spread across the surface. With a sound like splitting rock, the cuffs burst, shards flying outward. The stored magic exploded in a wave that knocked the headsman backward and sent guards sprawling. Sylas staggered to his feet, the chains now lengths of loose metal that he wrapped around his forearms. He swung them, the heavy links slicing through the air, cracking against armor and bone. He had never wielded such a weapon, yet it felt right, as if the chains that had bound him now served as extensions of his will. Chaos erupted in the courtyard. People screamed and scattered. Some drew weapons. Soldiers surged forward, but Sylas moved with a fierce clarity. He yanked the chain, catching a soldier by the legs and pulling him to the ground. He ducked under a swinging blade, the motion of the chains creating a circle of space around him. Lux, free momentarily of her guards, reached toward him, her face alight with hope. He met her eyes and offered a silent plea for forgiveness. He touched her once more, feeling a flash of her magic, and then turned to face the open gate. He did not want to harm her family, but he knew that hesitation could mean death for them both. He ran, his bare feet pounding the stone, the chains trailing like serpents. Guards shouted, arrows whistled past him. He felt the heat of a bolt graze his shoulder. He kept moving. The world beyond the compound opened up, filled with voices, colors, and smells. He vaulted over market stalls, scattering apples and cloth. He ducked down alleys he had once patrolled. Behind him, alarms rang. Ahead, freedom beckoned like a distant shore. He did not escape unscathed. The city he had once seen as a maze of oppression now became his ally in evasion. He knew the rhythms of its streets, the timings of guard patrols. He hid in cellars, in the shadows between buildings, always moving, never staying in one place for long. Word of the breakout spread quickly. To some, he became a villain, the proof of why mages should be kept in chains. To others, he became a symbol of defiance. Those living under the weight of the crown saw in him a flicker of possibility. He sought out others like himself, mages in hiding, those who had suppressed their gifts for fear of discovery. He spoke softly at first, sharing his story, listening to theirs. Many were reluctant. Years of persecution had taught them to mistrust any promise of freedom. Yet there were a few whose eyes lit with a kindred fire. They gathered in abandoned barns, in caves, in the gullies beyond the city. They shared food and plans. The chains he carried became both weapon and emblem. He wrapped them around his waist, their weight a reminder of where he had come from and what he intended to change. That night, as he sat by a small fire with a handful of those who had chosen to join him, Sylas felt the ache of his injuries and the rush of his newfound liberty. The stars seemed brighter outside the city walls, no longer dimmed by torches and palace lights. He thought of Lux, of her courage in touching him with magic that could have condemned her. He did not know what fate awaited her, but he vowed to repay her kindness by fighting for a world where she would not have to hide. The chain links glowed faintly in the firelight, each one bearing the memory of his imprisonment and the promise of uprising. He closed his eyes, breathing deeply of the night air. The road ahead would be fraught with danger, and he could not yet imagine how far it would carry him. For now, he felt the gentle brush of freedom across his skin, like the whisper of a dream. Sleep took him slowly, his mind filled with images of fields and forests, and the faces of those he hoped to liberate. Chapter 5, Return to Dregbourne. Freedom is intoxicating, but it is also disorienting. After years of walls and chains, the open landscapes beyond Demacia's capital felt endless. Sylas and the small group that accompanied him moved with caution. They travelled mostly at night, avoiding main roads, sleeping in hollows and under thick bushes. Their wounds healed gradually, leaving scars that would serve as reminders of the price of their escape. Sylas chains, once instruments of oppression, now hung around his shoulders like a mantle. He used them to ward off beasts and to train those who travelled with him. During the day, they rested, sharing stories of their past lives. Some had been blacksmiths, some shepherds, some students. Each had a tale of hiding and fear, of secrets whispered in candlelight. They spoke of the friends they had lost to the mage seekers and the families they had been forced to leave behind. These stories fueled Sylas' resolve. He had escaped not only for himself, but for all who had suffered under the laws he had once upheld. Eventually, their path led them back toward Dregbourne, the district of his youth. It was a journey he approached with trepidation. He had not seen his parents since the day they accompanied him to the mage seeker compound. In his mind, their faces had aged, their hair greyed. He wondered if they were still alive. The alleys of Dregbourne were narrower than he remembered. The smell of smoke and sweat was the same, however, thick in the air. People recognized him as he walked with his hood pulled low. Some whispered his name. Others gasped and drew back, fear etched on their faces. He understood. To them he was a murderer, a fugitive, a cause of trouble. To a few, he was a hope. He approached the door of the house where he had grown up. It leaned a little more than before, the boards weathered by time. He lifted his hand to knock and hesitated. He imagined the life inside continuing without him, the chairs placed just so, his mother humming softly as she cooked. When the door opened, his mother stood before him. Lines now bracketed her eyes, and her once dark hair was shot through with silver. For a moment, she did not recognize the man before her. Then her gaze traveled up to his eyes, and something like dawn broke across her face. She reached out a hand, and he stepped forward, his throat tight with emotion. She led him inside, and the familiar scent of broth and herbs enveloped him. His father sat at the table, his hands as calloused as ever. He looked up, startled. Joy and sorrow warred in his expression. There were no loud exclamations. They had learned the value of silence in a city that listened for whispers of magic. They embraced him, the warmth of their arms grounding him in a way nothing else had. They ate together, speaking little, savoring the presence of one another. His mother asked him to tell his story, and he did, slowly, leaving out the most painful parts. He could not bear to describe the dead bodies that haunted his dreams. He focused instead on his newfound purpose, on the people he had met, on the hope he carried like a fragile vessel. His parents listened, eyes brimming with tears. They spoke in turn, telling him of the years he had been gone. They had faced suspicion from neighbors and pressure from authorities. They had been visited by the mage seekers who demanded to know if they had hidden any signs of their son. They had lived in fear, both for him and for themselves. Yet they had also been supported quietly by others in the community who had lost children to the same system. His mother talked of nights she had spent staring at the door, wishing it would open. His father spoke of the anger that had grown within him, tempered only by the love he felt for the child he had raised. There was no blame in their words, only sadness and a fierce pride that he had survived. When the night grew deep, Sylas stood to leave. He could not stay. To remain would endanger them. He hugged them again, committing their faces to memory. In the doorway, he promised to return when it was safe. His mother pressed a small bundle into his hand, a piece of bread, a sprig of dried herbs, a talisman carved from wood. These were small things, but they were imbued with all the love she could not express openly. As he stepped back into the alley, he felt the weight of their hope settle upon his shoulders. After leaving his parents' home, Sylas visited other familiar places. He passed the square where he had played as a child. He walked by the old well where gossip had been exchanged. He saw faces that he recognized, older now, worn by time and hardship. Some nodded to him discreetly, others turned away, fearful of being seen in his company. He understood their caution. The city had become even more tightly controlled in his absence. Mage seekers patrolled more frequently, and informants were rewarded handsomely. Still, he managed to make contact with those he trusted. He whispered of plans, of gathering mages together, of not hiding anymore. A young man he had once known as a boy agreed to pass messages. A woman who had lost her sister to the gallows offered to provide shelter. The seeds of a network took root, subtle but resilient. As he left Dregbourne behind, he felt a mixture of sorrow and determination. The place that had shaped him was both home and prison. He knew he could not return until it had changed. He vowed to be part of that change, to transform the alleys of his youth from corridors of fear into avenues of freedom. Sylas and his companions travelled in widening circles around the capital, speaking to those who might join their cause. They encountered suspicion and enthusiasm in equal measure. Many had been so conditioned by fear that the idea of fighting back seemed impossible, but there were enough who were willing to take the risk. They met under cover of night, away from prying eyes. They shared skills and knowledge. Some among them knew how to cultivate the land. Others understood how to move unseen through the city. A few had studied magic in secret, developing talents that ranged from healing to weaving light. Sylas taught them what he had learned about petricite, about how it absorbed and could be forced to release magic. He showed them how to use chains as weapons, not to bind themselves, but to channel the power they carried. He also listened. Each person had a story, a reason for joining. These reasons varied: revenge, protection of loved ones, a belief in a world that could be different. Together, they formed the beginnings of a community. At night, around campfires, they spoke of dreams. One older man imagined a Demacia where mages could walk freely through the city without fear. A young woman wanted to study at the university without hiding. A mother wished for her daughter to be able to heal with her hands without being condemned. Sylas shared these dreams and added his own: to see the walls of his prison crumble, to hear the king acknowledge the injustice inflicted upon his people. He tempered these visions with realism. He knew that change would not come easily. The kingdom's structures were deeply rooted. But as he looked around the circle at the faces illuminated by firelight, he felt a strength that had been absent in his cell. They were no longer isolated individuals. They were becoming a group bound by shared purpose. He wrapped his chains tighter around his arms, feeling their familiar weight, and he vowed to carry them forward until they could be cast aside not just by him, but by all who had been bound. Sleep settled over the camp gradually, the crackle of embers and the whisper of leaves blending into a lullaby. In that quiet, Sylas allowed himself a moment of peace, knowing that the path ahead remained long and treacherous. Chapter 6. Gathering of the Exiles. As seasons turned, the small band of escapees grew into a network of exiles and renegades. Word of Sylas' escape travelled along the undercurrents of Demacia's society, whispered in taverns and markets, carried encoded messages and songs. Some dismissed the tales as fantasy, a story to frighten children. Others clung to the hope that there was someone out there willing to stand against the iron fist of the crown. Mages who had been living in hiding for years emerged quietly from their refuges. Farmers left their fields, blacksmiths left their forges, and scholars closed their books. They gathered at agreed meeting points: an abandoned quarry, a sheltered canyon, deep woods where the sunlight barely reached the ground. They came not just from Dregbourne, but from villages and towns across the countryside. For the first time, people who had only known isolation looked into the eyes of others who shared their plight. The effect was profound. There were tears and laughter as they realized they were not alone. Each arrival brought news, stories of cruelty at the hands of the mage seekers, but also of small acts of kindness, of neighbors who had looked away when they could have pointed fingers. With growth came challenges. Food had to be secured, shelters built, sentries posted. They were still fugitives, hunted by a kingdom that considered them criminals. Sylas recognized that they needed structure, but he was wary of replicating the hierarchies that had oppressed them. He encouraged discussion. Decisions were made collectively when possible. Those with experience in hunting organized supply lines. Those with knowledge of herbs tended to the sick. There were disagreements about strategy, about ethics, about whether to strike at the kingdom or to focus solely on protecting their own. Sylas listened, his own anger tempered by the need to build a sustainable community. He insisted that cruelty would not be met with cruelty among their own. They had lived under the yoke of fear long enough. Their camp would not become another place of oppression. Yet he was uncompromising when it came to the threat posed by mage seekers and nobles who profited from their suffering. He remembered the man on the carriage, the ring pulsing with magic, and he felt his resolve harden. Their fight was not just for survival, but for justice. Among those who joined was a young man named Hap. He arrived one morning escorted by a scout who had been out looking for potential allies. Hap was thin, his clothes patched and faded, his hair matted. His eyes, however, burned with determination. The scout introduced him, and Sylas studied the newcomer, sensing the flicker of magic within him. It was dark and heavy, coiled like a sleeping serpent. Hap spoke haltingly, explaining that the mage seekers had taken his family. He had escaped by hiding in a cart of hay, but he had nowhere to go. He had heard of Sylas and wanted to join. The camp, accustomed to new arrivals, still murmured in curiosity. Sylas stepped forward and placed a hand on Hap's shoulder. He felt the tension in the boy's body, the fear and hope intermingled. He told him he was welcome, that he would find no sir or master here, only brothers and sisters in pursuit of freedom. He introduced him to others from Dregbourne. For the first time in a long while, Hap's shoulders loosened, and a small smile ghosted across his face. Integration into the group was not immediate. Hap was young and inexperienced. He had not yet learned to control his magic. At night, by the fire, he would stare into the flames, his hands shaking. Sylas remembered those tremors from his own youth, the uncertainty and shame that came from feeling different. He took Hap under his wing, guiding him gently. He spoke of the currents of magic as he had perceived them for years, describing how to feel them without fear. He taught Hap how to focus his breathing, how to ground himself when the energy threatened to overwhelm. He told stories of those who had harnessed their abilities for healing, for growth, for art. These stories were like water to a parched plant. Hap soaked them in, his eyes brightening. He confided in Sylas that he had always felt cursed, that his family's misfortune had been his fault. Sylas shook his head, telling him that the fault lay not in their gifts, but in a society that punished those gifts. Slowly, the boy began to trust himself. He learned to weave small threads of his power, forming sparks that danced harmlessly in his palms. The camp would watch, their faces softening at the sight of youthful wonder. Training was not limited to magic. Sylas knew that if they were to stand against Demacia, they needed to be able to defend themselves physically. He organized drills at dawn, teaching them how to move together, how to use the terrain to their advantage. He showed them how to hold the chains in a way that allowed them to strike and defend. Those who had experience with weapons shared their knowledge. They practiced silently among the trees, the thud of wood against wood the only sound. At first, it was clumsy. People tripped, chains tangled, magic flared uncontrollably. There were injuries, bruises, and tears. But day by day, they improved. They learned to read each other's movements, to trust that the person beside them would hold the line. Bonds formed not just through shared suffering, but through shared effort. The camp became a place where people grew stronger together. Laughter returned, not often, but enough to remind them that life was more than struggle. Children who had grown up hiding began to play games among the tents, their giggles mingling with the rustle of leaves. In those moments, the future seemed attainable. Despite the sense of community, the threat from Demacia was constant. Patrols ventured farther into the countryside, and bounties were placed on Sylas' head. The mage seekers employed trackers, some of whom had abilities like his younger self. They could sense magic at a distance, and they were ruthless in their pursuit. There were close calls. Once, a patrol stumbled upon a lookout. The alarm was raised, and the camp dispersed into the forest like deer. Sylas and a small group engaged the seekers, using the chains to entangle them, to draw out their magic, to throw it back. The battle was quick and brutal. When it ended, the exiles stood over the bodies of those who had hunted them, breathing heavily, hearts pounding. They buried the fallen on the edge of the forest, saying quiet words for the dead. The fight left a mark. Hap sat by the burial, his hands shaking again. He whispered that he had never seen death up close. Sylas placed a hand on his shoulder, not with admonishment, but with understanding. He told him that grief and anger were both valid, that neither needed to be pushed aside. They needed to remember why they fought, so that they might one day live without having to. As autumn settled, painting the leaves in shades of gold and crimson, the camp prepared for winter. They stockpiled food, reinforced shelters, and made cloaks from animal skins. Sylas' mind, however, began to turn northward. He had heard rumors of ancient elemental magic in the Freljord, a place of ice and hardy people who had little love for Demacia's laws. If he could find allies there, perhaps he could bring back power strong enough to shake the foundations of his homeland. He spoke of this to a few trusted advisors. Some were hesitant. The journey was long and dangerous. The Freljord was a land of warring tribes, and outsiders were not always welcomed. Others saw the potential. New alliances could shift the balance. After many nights of discussion, they agreed that Sylas would venture north with a small contingent. They would leave once the last leaves fell. The camp would continue under the guidance of those remaining. It was not an easy decision. There were tears as they planned, knowing the risks, but there was also determination. They were fighting not just for themselves, but for all who would come after. With heavy hearts and steady minds, they prepared for the next chapter of their struggle. Chapter 7. Across the frozen mountains. The first touch of winter found Sylas and those chosen to accompany him on a narrow trail that wound upward into the mountains. The air grew thinner with each step, burning in their lungs and frosting the hairs at the edges of their faces. Beneath them, Demacia lay like a memory. Fields and forests shrouded in mist. Ahead, jagged peaks sliced into the sky. They carried little more than essential supplies, knowing the weight of their packs would slow them. Oxen plodded beside them, their breath steaming in the crisp air. Their hooves clattered on stone, a steady beat that matched the pounding of Sylas' heart. He had never been to the Freljord. The stories he had read spoke of endless snows, creatures born of ice, and warriors who wore furs and carried axes as if extensions of their arms. As the wind howled through the passes, he drew his cloak tighter around his shoulders and thought of the warmth of the camp they had left behind. Each step away was a step toward uncertainty. Travel was slow. Snow began to fall, first as a light dusting, then in thick flakes that clung to hair and eyelashes. Paths disappeared beneath drifts, forcing them to use staves to test the ground before stepping. The cold seeped through boots, through gloves, through layers of cloth. Fingers went numb, lips cracked. They sang songs to keep their spirits up, voices muffled by scarves. At night, they huddled together in caves or under overhanging rocks, bodies pressed close for warmth. They lit fires when they could find dry wood, but often they simply shared the heat of each other, breathing clouds of steam that rose and vanished into the dark. In those cramped shelters, Sylas told stories of the south. He spoke of the scent of rain on cobblestones, of the way sunlight caught dust motes in the air. The northerners in their group refugees who had fled Demacia years before countered with tales of the Freljord's beauty. They described auroras that painted the night with ribbons of light and ice fields that glowed blue under the moon. These stories blended with the crackle of fire, weaving a tapestry of hope and anticipation. The mountains tested them. One afternoon, as they traversed a narrow ledge, the path gave way under the weight of an ox. The creature tumbled, legs flailing, its cry echoing against rock walls. The rope that connected it to the others snapped, and for a breathless moment, Sylas watched it fall into whiteness below, powerless to help. The loss was not just of an animal, but of supplies, of momentum. They pressed on, hearts heavy. Another time, a storm descended with sudden ferocity. Wind whipped snow into blinding sheets, scraping exposed skin. They hunkered down, leaning into the mountain, while Sylas wrapped his arms around those closest to him, his chains clinking softly as they shifted. He focused on his breathing, on the slow in and out that signaled life. He thought of the petricite, of how it had absorbed magic, of how now it absorbed the cold. He considered the resilience of stone and mirrored that resilience within himself. When the storm passed, they emerged to a world transformed. Trees bowed under new weight, and the sky was a clear, sharp blue. They took in the beauty with awe, their hardships momentarily forgotten. As they climbed, signs of habitation appeared, tracks in the snow, a feather caught on a branch, smoke curling from a distant crevice. They followed these hints cautiously. They were strangers in a land where strangers were often met with suspicion. One morning, as dawn painted the clouds pink, they rounded a bend and found themselves staring at a group of figures blocking the path. Women and men clad in furs and leathers stood with spears and axes, their breath visible in the cold. Their eyes were sharp, their stances ready. A woman with braids woven with bone stepped forward. Her gaze swept over the group, lingering on Sylas' chains. She spoke in a language he did not understand. One of the northerners in his group translated. She demanded to know who they were and why they travelled in their land. Sylas stepped forward, hands raised to show he carried no blade, only the chains that draped his forearms. He introduced himself, speaking of Demacia's oppression and his desire to find allies. He chose his words carefully, each one heavy with the sincerity he felt. He spoke of magic suppressed and lives lost, of a hunger for freedom. The leader listened, her expression unreadable. When Sylas finished, she responded with a few terse phrases. The translator explained that they would be taken to speak with Sejuani, the war leader of the Winter's Claw. It was clear that refusal was not an option. Their weapons were taken, though Sylas' chains were allowed to remain wrapped around his arms. They were led through winding paths into a valley where tents and wooden huts clustered together like a village of snow-dusted mushrooms. Fires burned in pits, and the smell of cooked meat filled the air. Children with red cheeks peered out from behind firs, curious at the newcomers. Warriors sharpened blades and mended harnesses. The life of the tribe carried on even as eyes tracked the strangers. Sylas noted the efficiency and the sense of community, so different from the pomp of Demacia's court. Despite the weapons around them, he felt a sense of cohesion that warmed him more than any cloak. These were people who had endured harshness and had built strength from it. He hoped they might see in his cause a reflection of their own struggles. Chapter 8. The Winter's Claw. Sejuani's presence was undeniable. When Sylas was finally ushered into her tent, he felt the air shift. She stood tall, broad-shouldered, wrapped in heavy furs. Her hair was the color of dark ice, and her gaze cut like a blade. Around her neck hung symbols of her tribe, carved from bone and horn. She appraised Sylas with a mixture of curiosity and caution. Behind her, maps of the Freljord were pinned to a wooden board, marked with carvings and stones that likely represented tribes and paths. Sejuani spoke, her voice low and controlled. A translator relayed her words. She wanted to know why she should risk her warriors for a foreigner's fight. The Freljord had its own conflicts, rival tribes, encroaching threats from frost and famine, ancient beasts stirring under the ice. What did Demacia's politics matter to them? Sylas drew a breath, feeling the weight of history on his shoulders. He began by acknowledging the differences between their worlds. He described Demacia not as a faceless enemy, but as a kingdom built on fear of the very magic the Freljord embraced. He spoke of the towers of petricite that lined the capital, of the laws that stripped mages of their humanity. He did not hide his past service to that regime or the blood that stained his hands. He confessed his guilt and spoke of his transformation. Then he turned to their similarities. He told of the oppression faced by those born with magic, likening it to the persecution some Freljordian clans had endured from their rivals. He spoke of the power of unity, of what could be achieved if those with different strengths joined forces. He painted a picture of a future where Demacia's fear no longer dictated the life of its citizens, and where the Freljord might gain a steadfast ally to the south. His words flowed slowly, measured, each one an offering. Sejuani listened without interrupting. Her eyes flicked to the chains on his arms, the ones that had bound him and now served as his weapon. She asked about them. Sylas explained their nature, how they had once suppressed him, and how he had learned to use them to channel and release magic. He demonstrated by touching one of her warriors, drawing a spark of frost magic into the stone, and then releasing it in a plume of cold air that danced between his fingers. The watchers murmured. Sejuani's expression remained inscrutable, but a glint appeared in her eyes. She gestured for him to continue. Sylas spoke of the strength he saw in the Winter's Claw, of their resilience in the face of adversity. He said that Demacia feared not just magic, but also what it could not control. If the tribes of the Freljord and the exiles of Demacia stood together, they could present a force that would make any king think twice. Silence followed his plea. In that pause, Sylas heard the crackle of the fire, the distant laughter of children, the howl of wind outside. Sejuani finally responded. She did not agree to an alliance immediately. Instead, she proposed a test. The Freljord trusted strength and deeds over words. If Sylas wished to prove his worth, he would accompany her warriors on a hunt. The target was not a human, but a creature of ice and magic that had been terrorizing nearby villages, a huge boar-like beast with tusks of crystal. If Sylas could stand alongside the Winter's Claw and face this challenge, then they would consider his request. He accepted without hesitation. In his mind, he saw again the healers and children he had failed to protect. This hunt would be a chance to show that he had grown, that he could direct his power not toward destruction of innocence, but toward defending those in need. Sejuani nodded, and the meeting concluded. Outside, the cold bit at his cheeks, but his blood ran hot with purpose. The hunt commenced at dawn the next day. Warriors strapped on armor made of leather and fur, adorned with talismans carved from bone. They led shaggy tusk-lord mounts massive beasts bred for the harsh environment. Sylas swung his chains around his shoulders, feeling their comforting weight. He mounted behind one of the riders, gripping the animal's fur as they took off into the snow-covered plains. The cold air stung his eyes, and his breath crystallized before him. He focused on the landscape, on the way the snowdrifts shaped the ground, on the distant shapes of mountains. They moved as one, a silent line gliding across the whiteness. It was both exhilarating and humbling. For years he had been confined. Now he flew across open expanses, part of a pack. The beast they hunted had left a trail of broken trees and churned ice. They followed these signs until they reached a valley where the wind whipped in unpredictable gusts. There, in the center, the creature stood. It was enormous, its body covered in a hide of ice shards, eyes like blue flames. It bellowed, the sound reverberating across the valley. The Winter's Claw encircled the beast, weapons ready. Sejuani herself rode at the front, her presence like that of a storm. Sylas leaped from his mount, his chains swinging in wide arcs. He watched as the creature charged at them, tusks lowered. A warrior to his left cast a spear of frost that shattered against the beast's side. Another threw a net imbued with magic that slowed its movement. Sylas ran toward it, feeling the surge of adrenaline. He waited until the creature's gaze landed on him, then reached out with his chains. He hooked them around one of its tusks, feeling the jolt up his arms as it tried to pull away. He held firm, planting his feet in the snow, drawing upon the strength of those behind him. He channeled the magic stored in the chains, releasing bursts of heat and cold in succession, confusing the creature's senses. It roared, shaking its head, trying to dislodge him. Behind him, Sejuani rode forward and buried her spear in the beast's flank. Others followed, coordinating their attacks. In moments that stretched like minutes, the creature weakened. It staggered, its breath coming in labored clouds. Sylas felt the tension ease. With a final coordinated push, they brought the beast down. It lay still, its body steaming as the remaining magic dissipated. Panting, Sylas stood amidst the snow, his hands numb from cold and exertion. He looked around at the warriors, their faces flushed, their eyes gleaming with triumph. Sejuani dismounted and approached him. She placed a hand on the creature's hide in a gesture of respect, then turned to Sylas. She nodded once, a gesture of approval. She spoke, her tone warmer than before. The translator conveyed her words. He had proven himself. His strength and his ability to work alongside the tribe showed that he was more than empty words. She agreed to send warriors with him when the time came, and she would provide him with knowledge of the Freljord's ancient magics. Gratitude surged in Sylas' chest. He bowed his head, not as a subject to a queen, but as one leader acknowledging another. That night, back in the camp, they feasted on the beast. Stories were told, songs sung. Sylas listened, absorbing the rhythm of the Freljord. His path had led him far from the Undercity, and yet the sense of community he had sought was here as well. He slept under a sky ablaze with auroras, the colors shifting and shimmering. Dreams carried him across both ice and stone. Chapter 9. Lessons in Ice and Fire. The days that followed in the Freljord were filled with learning and adaptation. Sylas had grown up in a land where magic was hidden and feared. In the Winter's Claw camp, magic was part of daily life. It was not a separate force, but woven into their relationship with the land. Sejuani introduced him to shamans and seers who understood the ancient ways. An elder woman with hair like silver spoke to him about the spirits that walk the tundra. She taught him how to feel the rhythm of the earth under the snow, how to listen to the whisper of wind across ice. He sat with her for hours, eyes closed, hands pressed against frozen ground, learning to distinguish between the hum of latent power and the passing of a snow fox. She showed him how the energy in the Freljord was different from the magic of Demacia. It was older, wilder, less contained. It did not belong to individuals. It belonged to the land and was shared by those who respected it. Sylas chains reacted differently in this environment. The petricite that made them absorb the magic indiscriminately, but the elemental energy of the Freljord was more elusive. When he tried to draw it in, it slipped through his grasp like powdered snow through fingers. Frustrated, he returned to the elder. She smiled and told him that he was still thinking like someone who wished to control. She instructed him to let go of the desire to command and instead to invite. He spent evenings by icy streams, allowing the cold to numb his hands until he could barely feel them. He focused on the sensation of the water, on its flow. Slowly, he began to sense the presence of the magic around him, not as something to be seized, but as something that would come to him if he was open. The first time he successfully drew in a thread of frost magic, it did not feel like the surge of stolen power in Demacia. It was gentle, like a cool breeze that kissed his skin. He released it, and it formed delicate crystals in the air that glittered before falling. He laughed, a sound carried away by the wind, delighted by the purity of the moment. He trained with the warriors as well. They taught him how to move in snowshoes, how to wield a throwing axe without losing balance, how to read the sky to predict storms. He shared with them his knowledge of chains and petricite, showing them how to use the stone to absorb small bursts of magic and release them in controlled ways. Together, they experimented. A young warrior discovered that by wrapping petricite shards around arrowheads, they could create projectiles that, when charged with a whisper of magic, exploded in a burst of frost upon impact. Another realized that weaving petricite into the hilt of a spear allowed them to draw energy from the ground with each thrust. These innovations were met with cheers around the fire. There was a sense of mutual respect growing, born from shared curiosity and a willingness to learn from each other's experiences. The bond between Sylas and Sejuani deepened. Though their backgrounds were vastly different, they both carried scars inflicted by systems that sought to control them. Sejuani confided in him about the rival tribes, about the Frostguard led by the mysterious Lysandra, and about how the Freljord had once been united under the three sisters. She spoke of her desire to see her people strong and independent, not pawns in the games of others. Sylas shared his vision for Demacia, of mages walking openly, of walls replaced by bridges. They debated tactics, with Sejuani leaning toward direct confrontation and Sylas speaking of guerrilla actions and sabotage. Their disagreements were passionate but respectful. Each saw in the other a determination that mirrored their own. On nights when the auroras danced overhead, they sat in silence, watching the lights shift, feeling the immense weight of their respective tasks. The lights seemed to whisper of ancient battles and future possibilities, of cycles of ice and thaw. Despite the camaraderie, there were also cultural differences that caused friction. Sylas was used to making decisions collectively within his band. The Winter's Claw followed Sejuani's commands with unquestioning loyalty. There was little room for dissent. When a young warrior complained about a risky raid, he was silenced quickly. Sylas wondered if there was any room for dialogue. He spoke with Sejuani about it, cautiously. She explained that in the frozen wastes, hesitation meant death. Orders had to be followed swiftly. In the south, he had opposed blind obedience to authority. In the north, he saw how it could be necessary for survival. He grappled with this paradox, understanding that not all structures of power were alike. He resolved to balance his belief in collective decision-making with the realities of different cultures. This understanding would later inform how he led his own people. It is easy to reject all authority when one has known only tyranny, but there are contexts where leadership can be life-saving. He learned to discern between oppressive control and protective guidance. As winter deepened, Sylas prepared to depart. He had learned much, and he carried with him not only new skills and knowledge, but also an understanding of how other societies functioned. Sejuani gathered her warriors, selecting those who would accompany him south when the time came. She promised to send them when he signaled. In return, Sylas promised to honor the trust she had placed in him. The elder who had taught him about the spirits gave him a small amulet carved from ice that did not melt. It was infused with the essence of the Freljord, she said, a reminder of the land and its people. He tucked it inside his cloak. On the day of his departure, the tribe gathered to say farewells. There were hugs and firm grips, laughter and tears. Sylas mounted his tusk lord, his chains wrapped securely. As he rode out of the camp, he looked back once, seeing figures outlined against the white, small but unbowed. He knew he would return one day, not as a supplicant, but as an ally. The road south beckoned, long and fraught, but his purpose was clear. The lessons of ice and fire would guide him as he resumed his fight for freedom. Chapter 10. Flames of Rebellion. The journey back to Demacia was swifter than the one northward. With the knowledge of the paths and the aid of the Freljordian mounts, Sylas and his small band descended the mountains with greater confidence. They timed their travel to avoid major patrol routes, relying on the lessons of stealth he had learned over the past months. When they finally reached the outskirts of his homeland, the sight of the familiar landscape, rolling hills, patchwork fields, and dense forests stirred a complex mix of emotions. He felt the warmth of homecoming and the chill of remembered oppression. The news they gathered upon their return was troubling. The king had doubled down on mage hunts in response to reports of growing resistance. More mages had been arrested. Some had been executed as warnings. The streets of Dregbourne hummed with tension. People spoke in hushed tones, looking over their shoulders. It was clear that the window for action was narrowing. If they waited too long, the rebellion would be crushed under the heel of increased security. Sylas sought out his camp, hidden deep in the canyon where he had first begun to gather exiles. It had grown in his absence. New faces greeted him, some lined with age, others bright with youthful determination. He hugged those he had known, exchanged greetings with those he had not yet met. They asked about the north, and he told them stories of snow and auroras, of Sejuani's stern gaze, and the strength of the winter's claw. He introduced the Freljordian warriors who had travelled with him, strong figures with fur cloaks and eyes that glinted like ice. There was an air of celebration at his return, but it was tempered by urgency. They did not have the luxury of long reunions. Plans had to be made. They sat around a table carved from a fallen tree, unrolling maps marked with supply routes and patrol schedules. They debated targets. Should they strike at mage-seeker convoys transporting prisoners? Should they sabotage the petricite mines that fed the kingdom's ability to suppress magic? Each idea came with risks. Sylas listened, weighing each suggestion, drawing upon both his own experience and the lessons from the Freljord. They decided on a series of small, coordinated strikes. The goal was not to overthrow the kingdom in one blow that was impossible, but to chip away at its foundation, to inspire more mages to join, to strain the resources of the mage seekers. The first target would be a convoy transporting captured mages to the capital. They scouted the route, noting where the road narrowed and where forest cover was thickest. On the chosen night, they hid among the trees, breaths quiet, hearts thudding. Sylas positioned himself where he could intercept the lead cart. When the convoy appeared, lanterns swaying, horses snorting in the dark, he waited for the moment when the rear guard was swallowed by the bend in the road. Then he signaled. Arrows imbued with frost magic flew from the branches, striking wheels and legs. Horses reared, carts lurched. Mages hidden under tarps cried out. Exiles sprang from their concealment, chains and axes flashing. The fight was quick. The mage seekers were caught off guard. Sylas used his chains to pull them from their mounts, absorbing their magic and turning it back in blinding bursts. Within minutes, the convoy was overpowered. They freed the prisoners, offering them cloaks and water. Some of the freed wept. Others grabbed weapons and joined the fray. The strike was a success. They melted back into the forest before reinforcements could arrive. The impact of these actions rippled through Demacia. More mages began to seek out the exiles. Stories of successful ambushes spread, emboldening those who had been hiding. The mage seekers, embarrassed by their losses, tightened their patrols and set harsher penalties. They raided villages suspected of harboring mages, interrogated families, and imposed curfews. This, in turn, fueled resentment among the populace. People who had previously been indifferent began to question the fairness of the laws. Sylas understood that each act of repression by the crown created more sympathizers for their cause. He walked a fine line. He wanted to inflict damage on the structures that oppressed them, but he did not want to provoke indiscriminate violence that would hurt the innocents he sought to liberate. It was a delicate balance, requiring constant vigilance. He instructed his fighters to avoid harming those who were forced into service by circumstance. They focused on guards known for their cruelty and on infrastructure that sustained the oppressive system. As the rebellion grew bolder, Sylas found himself grappling with conflicting emotions. He had dreamed of this moment in his cell, standing against his oppressors, feeling the rush of taking back power. Yet now, as he planned raids and watched his comrades risk their lives, he felt the heavy cost. People he cared about were injured. Some did not return from missions. Each loss weighed on him. He remembered their faces, their laughter by the fire, the hopes they had shared. He carried the grief with him, folding it into his resolve. He also thought of Lux. Rumors reached him that she had been confined to her family's estate. Watch closely lest she reveal her abilities. He longed to see her, to explain the choices he had made, to thank her. But he could not risk her safety. He kept his distance, hoping that in some future where the laws had changed, they could meet again as equals and not as prisoner and savior. At night, when the camp settled into uneasy rest, he would sit by the dying embers and stare into the glowing coals, their red depths reminding him of the Freljord's ice and the heat of rebellion. Chapter 11. Fireside Moral Compass. Momentum can be intoxicating. As the exiles' victories mounted, cheers grew louder and the sense of possibility spread. There was a temptation to push harder, to strike at bigger targets, to force a confrontation. Some among the rebels argued for an assault on the capital, to cut off the head of the snake. Others urged caution, reminding the group of the formidable defenses and the thousands of soldiers loyal to the crown. Sylas listened to these debates, hearing in them echoes of the discussions he had had in the Freljord about when to trust leadership and when to challenge it. He weighed the urgency for change against the responsibility he carried for the lives of those who followed him. He knew that one poorly planned attack could undo everything they had achieved. He also felt the impatience burning in his veins. He remembered the damp cell, the cold of the petricide, the faces of those he had lost. He wanted to tear down the walls of the city with his bare hands, but he could not allow anger to become recklessness. He resolved to let strategy guide him, even when his emotions clamored for decisive action. One evening, as the camp gathered around a large fire, voices rose in argument. A group that had returned from a raid on a noble's estate described how they had captured the Lord and his servants. They spoke of the urge to exact vengeance for the years of exploitation. Some had argued to kill the servants along with the Lord, reasoning that anyone who served such a man was complicit. Hap, now more confident in his abilities and growing into a leader among the younger rebels, had intervened. He had stood between the captives and the swords of his own comrades, insisting that there was a difference between those who chose to oppress and those who served out of fear or lack of choice. His words echoed the mercy that Sylas had once hesitated to show. As he recounted the incident, Hap's eyes met Sylas across the fire. There was an unspoken question there. Are we becoming the very thing we fight against? Sylas felt pride and unease. He remembered when he had urged Hap to execute a captive nobleman, how the boy had faltered, how he had taken the life himself. He had justified it as necessary, as a message to the powerful. Now, hearing Hap advocate for restraint, he realized that the younger man had grown beyond the shadow of his leader. Sylas stood, the firelight flickering across his face. He addressed the group. He spoke of anger, how it was a fuel, a force that could drive them, but also a fire that could consume indiscriminately. He reminded them of why they fought, not to replace one tyranny with another, but to create a world where magic was not a crime, and where people were judged by their actions, not their birth. He acknowledged his own past mistakes, his moments of brutality. He did not excuse them. He said that they must be better than the system they opposed. Every life they took must be weighed carefully. Each act of violence must serve a purpose beyond vengeance. His words were met with silence and then, gradually, nods. Hap looked relieved. That night Sylas lay awake, watching the stars through the gaps in the canopy. The weight of leadership pressed down on him. He had not sought to be a symbol or a commander. He had been thrust into that role by circumstance. He thought of the Freljord, where obedience was demanded but earned through shared hardship, and of Demacia, where obedience was enforced through fear. He wanted to forge a different path, one where people followed because they believed in the cause, not because they feared the consequences of dissent. He whispered to the night his hopes and doubts, letting them drift into the darkness. Sleep came slowly, filled with dreams of chains and snow, of fires and faces. The next morning, he sought out Hap. They walked together along a river, the water reflecting the pale light of dawn. Sylas apologized for the pressure he had put on the boy months ago, acknowledging that he had asked Hap to shoulder a burden that should not have been his. Hap listened, then smiled. He told Sylas that he had learned from that moment, that the weight of that decision had forced him to think about who he wanted to be. He said he forgave Sylas, but that he would continue to speak up when he disagreed. Sylas nodded, grateful for the honesty. They returned to camp with a renewed sense of trust. From that day, Sylas made a point of inviting more voices into planning sessions. He recognized that the rebellion was not his alone. It belonged to everyone who risked their life for it. In sharing responsibility, he also shared the burden of decision-making. This distributed leadership became a strength. It allowed them to adapt quickly, to draw on diverse perspectives, and to prevent any one person from holding absolute authority. Even as they strove to be just, the violence of their struggle could not be entirely avoided. Patrols ambushed them. Traps were set in the forests. There were nights when they returned to camp with fewer than had set out. Sylas attended each burial personally. He helped dig graves, his hands blistering, his back aching. He spoke the names of the fallen aloud, refusing to let them fade into anonymity. He told stories of their bravery, of their kindness, of the small details that made them unique. These rituals grounded the rebellion in humanity. They reminded the living of what they were fighting for and for whom. They also reminded Sylas that each decision had a cost. This awareness kept him vigilant against the seductive allure of power. In the flicker of candlelight, he saw his younger self in his cell, and he vowed never to become the man who had locked him there. Chapter 12. Clash of Steel and Ideals. The escalation of the conflict was inevitable. As the exiles' raid struck deeper into the kingdom's supply lines, the crown responded with greater force. Sir Garin Crownguard, one of Demacia's most revered warriors and Luck's brother, took command of the Mage Seeker battalions. He was known for his unwavering loyalty, his strength, and his belief in Demacia's ideals. His presence on the battlefield signaled that the king now viewed the rebellion as a threat that required the attention of his finest. Sylas remembered Garen from the day of his execution, the man who had stood stoic as Lux pleaded for mercy. He knew that facing him would be both a strategic and emotional challenge. Garen represented everything the kingdom claimed to be: honorable, steadfast, unyielding. To defeat him would be to strike at the symbolic heart of Demacia. The first clash between Sylas' forces and Garen's troops occurred on a plain dotted with wildflowers. The contrast between the beauty of the setting and the violence that erupted there would haunt Sylas for years. They had chosen the location deliberately. It was far enough from major settlements to minimize collateral damage, and near enough to supply routes to force Garen into engagement. Sylas stood at the front line, chains wrapped tightly, flanked by Freljordian warriors whose breath misted in the morning air. Across the field, rows of Demacian soldiers in shining armor formed disciplined ranks. Banners bearing the sunburst emblem fluttered above them. Garen rode at the front on his warhorse, his sword at his side. Their eyes met across the distance. For a moment, there was an unspoken acknowledgement of the weight of what was about to unfold. Then Garen raised his sword, and the army advanced. The clash was brutal. The ground shook under the force of charging horses and the stamp of boots. Arrows darkened the sky. Magic and steel collided. Sylas wove through the battlefield, his chains spinning, deflecting blades, wrapping around enemies to pull them off balance. He absorbed bursts of magic from the mages within Garen's ranks, light spells designed to blind and stun, and return them with blasts of ice and heat learned from the Freljord. Each movement was a dance between attack and defense, between unleashing power and protecting his comrades. He saw Garen cutting through the Freljordian line, his sword arcs leaving trails of light. They met near the center of the field. Garen swung his blade and Sylas brought up his chains. The force of the blow sent a vibration up his arms. They circled each other, testing, searching for openings. Garen's face was set, his jaw clenched. Sylas spoke between breaths, saying that Demacia's laws were broken, that mages deserved freedom. Garen responded, his voice carrying across the clash, that order kept people safe, that chaos would bring ruin. They were two sides of a coin, each convinced of their righteousness. Their duel was not merely physical, it was ideological. Each strike carried years of history. Each parry was an argument. Sylas saw in Garen the fear of change, the desire to protect family and nation. He also saw the blind spots, the unwillingness to see the suffering inflicted by the laws he defended. As they fought, the battle around them raged. Warriors fell, cries rang out. A Freljordian shaman was struck by a spear, her body crumpling into the flowers. A Demacian foot soldier slipped in the mud and was trampled. Sylas felt the weight of each life. The duel could not be separated from the larger context. At one point, Sylas managed to hook his chain around Garen's wrist, pulling him close. Their faces were inches apart. Sylas said that Lux was a mage, that Garen's own sister suffered under the system he upheld. Garen's eyes widened, a flicker of pain crossing his features. His grip tightened. He pulled free, pushing Sylas back with a shield bash. The fight resumed, fiercer. Ultimately, there was no decisive victor. Both sides were forced to retreat as reinforcements approached from neighboring towns. The exiles melted into the forest, carrying their wounded. Garen regrouped his troops, tending to theirs. The plain was left scarred. the wildflowers crushed under footprints and blood. That night, Sylas sat with his head in his hands. The image of Garen's face, torn between duty and love for his sister, burned in his mind. He realized that even those who opposed him were trapped by their own loyalties and beliefs. Changing hearts and minds would be as important as winning battles. He also understood that the price of this war would continue to mount. The next day, they buried their dead, laying them among the flattened flowers. Sylas spoke words of gratitude, promising that their sacrifices would not be in vain. He sent word to the Freljord, requesting additional aid. He also sent a message to Lux, carried by a trusted courier, telling her that he had faced her brother, that he knew of her secret, and that he hoped she was safe. He signed it not as a demand or plea, but as a simple declaration. We are fighting for a world where you can live free. Chapter 13. Threads of Connection. The letter to Lux weighed heavily on Sylas. He had debated sending it, knowing that any contact with her could endanger her further, but the memory of her hand pressed against his chains, of her willingness to risk everything to help him, compelled him to reach out. He kept the message simple, speaking of hope and safety, acknowledging the complexity of their positions. He did not know if she would receive it, much less respond. He returned to his duties, pushing the thought to the back of his mind. The rebellion did not pause for personal matters. Supply runs needed organizing, new recruits needed training, strategies needed refining. Yet, in quiet moments, his thoughts strayed to the girl who had brought light into his darkest place. Weeks later, a runner arrived at camp, breathless, clutching a small piece of parchment. It was a response. Lux had written in careful script, thanking him for his message and expressing relief that he was alive. She wrote of her confinement and the watchful eyes of her family. She spoke of her own struggles to reconcile love for her country with the knowledge of its injustices. She expressed fear for her brother, caught between duty and truth. She also wrote that she believed change was possible, that she could feel it in the way people whispered, in the cracks forming in the once unassailable walls of tradition. She encouraged Sylas to continue but urged caution. She ended with a line that made his chest tighten. I hope one day we can stand under the same sky, not as fugitive and lady, but as allies working toward a common future. Reading her words, Sylas felt a surge of emotion. It was not the romantic love of bard songs, but a deep bond forged through shared experience and mutual respect. He folded the letter carefully and tucked it inside his coat, close to his heart. It became a talisman, a reminder of why he fought. He imagined Lux sitting at a desk, quill in hand, casting furtive glances at the door to ensure she was not discovered. He thought of her courage in acknowledging her own magic in a world that would condemn her for it. He resolved to protect that courage by continuing his work with integrity. The exchange with Lux also spurred him to reach out to others beyond his immediate circle. He wrote to scholars in Piltover who had studied magic from a scientific perspective, asking for advice on neutralizing petricite. He sent messengers to Ionia, seeking insight from those who had long integrated magic into everyday life. Responses came slowly, carried by travelers and traders. Some offered practical guidance. An Ionian monk wrote of meditation techniques that allowed mages to control their energy so that it would not trigger petricite sensors. A Piltovan researcher suggested that certain vibrations could disrupt the absorption properties of the stone. These insights added to the rebels' toolkit. They experimented in small groups, always mindful of the dangers. Slowly, they began to develop methods not just to fight the mage seekers, but to undermine the tools that gave Demacia its power. Within Demacia, not everyone opposed to the rebellion was an enemy. There were sympathetic nobles who quietly sent supplies or turned a blind eye when exiles passed through their lands. There were merchant guilds tired of the disruptions caused by the kingdom's rigid policies. Sylas sent emissaries to these groups, forging clandestine alliances. He offered protection in exchange for resources. He promised that in the new order they envisioned, those who had helped would be remembered. This network of supporters within the walls proved invaluable. They provided information about troop movements and about the mood among the elites. They also sheltered mages in their cellars and attics. These acts of quiet resistance were as important as open confrontation. They showed that change was not solely the work of those wielding weapons. It was also in the hands of those who dared to act differently within their own spheres of influence. Still, the complexities of these alliances weighed on Sylas. Trust was fragile. A supportive noble could one day change their mind if they felt threatened. A merchant could decide that profit mattered more than principle. He knew that people were motivated by a variety of factors, not all of which aligned perfectly with his ideals. He navigated these relationships carefully, maintaining a balance between gratitude and caution. He refused to become beholden to anyone's agenda. The rebellion's goal remained clear: to overturn the unjust laws and to create a society where magic was not a crime. Anything that compromised that goal was a threat, regardless of how it was disguised. In navigating these political currents, he drew upon the diplomacy he had watched Lux employ during their secret meetings. He mirrored her patience, her ability to listen, and her skill in finding common ground without conceding core values. Chapter 14. Shifts in the kingdom change rarely occurs in isolation. The tremors created by the rebellion reverberated beyond Demacia's borders. Noxus watched with interest, seeing an opportunity to weaken a rival. Ionia, still recovering from its own conflicts, sent quiet prayers and the occasional wandering sage. Piltover debated whether to invest resources in a potential new trade partner should Demacia's strict restrictions on magic end. Within Demacia, the political landscape shifted. Rumors circulated that the king's health was failing. Whispers in taverns spoke of court intrigue, of nobles positioning themselves for greater influence. Some said that the heir, Prince Jarvan, was more sympathetic to mages than his father, having witnessed the cost of repression firsthand. Others argued that he was as bound by tradition as any crown guard. Amid this uncertainty, the rebellion continued its work, applying pressure on the system. One afternoon, as Sylas met with his advisors, a scout arrived with news that sent a hush through the camp. King Jarvan III had died unexpectedly. The circumstances were murky. Official reports claimed illness. Rumors suggested poison. The prince had been crowned as the new ruler. Jarvan IV was young, energetic, and popular among the soldiers. He had fought on the front lines against Noxus and had been celebrated for his bravery. His ascension marked a turning point. Would he continue his father's policies, or would he chart a new course? Sylas felt a flicker of hope tempered by caution. A change in leadership could mean an opening for dialogue. It could also mean harsher crackdowns as the new king sought to assert his authority. The first decree of the new king was to pardon certain debts and to reduce taxes on small farmers, a populist move that endeared him to the common people. His second decree, however, reaffirmed the laws against unauthorized magic, with a promise to review them in the future. It was a gesture that spoke of caution. He was unwilling to appear weak on security, even as he hinted at potential reform. The mage seekers saw this as validation of their role and intensified their efforts to prove their worth. Sylas read the decree, noting the careful language. It was ambiguous enough to allow the king room to maneuver. He saw an opportunity. If the rebellion could demonstrate that mages were not a threat, but valuable citizens, then the new king might be persuaded to accelerate reform. If, however, the conflict escalated into greater violence, it could justify further repression. This realization added urgency to their efforts to avoid harming innocents and to highlight acts of mercy. Sylas decided to send an emissary to the court, a bold and dangerous move. They would not seek an audience with the king directly that would likely result in immediate arrest, but they would approach a trusted intermediary. After much deliberation, they chose a minor noble known for advocating for educational reform. The emissary carried a message outlining the rebels' demands: repeal of laws criminalizing magic, release of imprisoned mages, and a seat at the table to discuss a new societal order. The letter emphasized that the rebellion did not seek to topple the monarchy, but to transform Demacia into a nation where magic and non-magic citizens could coexist peacefully. It appealed to the king's sense of justice and to his desire to be remembered as a reformer. The risk was immense. If the letter fell into the wrong hands, it could lead to mass arrests, but the potential reward, a chance at negotiation, was worth it. While waiting for a response, the rebels continued their work. They focused on building infrastructure in the territories they controlled, creating safe havens where mages could practice openly and where children could learn about their abilities without fear. They experimented with new forms of governance, testing ideas about shared leadership and consensus decision-making. These experiments were messy and imperfect. There were disagreements about resource allocation, about how to handle disputes, about how to integrate non-mages who wished to join. Through trial and error, they developed a system that balanced individual autonomy with collective responsibility. In these microcosms, they glimpsed the society they hoped to create. People grew food, traded goods, and offered each other services based on needs and skills. The air in these enclaves felt lighter. Laughter was more frequent. For Sylas, these spaces were proof that their dream was not just a fantasy. It could be real, if only they could protect it. Weeks passed with no word from the court. Tension built. Some argued that the lack of response meant the king was uninterested or had never received the message. Others cautioned patience. In the meantime, a surprising development occurred. A group of Demacian soldiers defected to the rebel cause. They arrived under cover of darkness, weapons laid down, hands raised. Their leader, a captain, spoke of witnessing cruelty during raids on villages suspected of harboring mages. She said her conscience could no longer bear the orders she was given. She had heard of Sylas from her soldiers and decided to seek him out. Sylas welcomed them cautiously. aware that infiltration was a possibility. After days of careful observation and questioning, he accepted them. Their presence bolstered the rebellion and sent shockwaves through the military. It proved that not all who wore the crown's colours supported its policies. It also increased pressure on the king to address the growing unrest. Chapter 15. The emissaries' return. When the response from the court finally came, it was as unexpected as it was cryptic. One misty morning, a hooded figure rode into the rebel camp under a white flag. He dismounted with slow, deliberate movements, hands kept visible at all times. He carried a sealed scroll, bound with blue ribbon and stamped with the emblem of the crown. The exiles watched, hands on weapons, unsure whether this was a trap. Sylas stepped forward to meet the messenger. The man introduced himself as a lesser noble, representing a council of advisors appointed by the new king. He handed over the scroll and withdrew several paces, remaining under guard. The seal broke easily under Sylas' thumb. The letter inside was written in a careful hand. It was not from the king himself, but from his chamberlain. It acknowledged receipt of the rebels' demands, thanked them for their restraint in avoiding civilian casualties, and proposed a meeting at a neutral site to discuss the possibility of reforms. It also warned that any attack during this parley would be met with overwhelming force. It was a cautious olive branch. Reactions were mixed. Some in the camp saw this as a chance for progress, an opening to negotiate from a position of strength. Others suspected a trap, fearing that the crown intended to lure their leaders into the open. Sylas listened to both sides. He thought of his time in chains, of the promises made by those in power that had turned to lies. He also thought of the people who had died in this struggle, and of the countless others who would die if the conflict continued indefinitely. He recognized that negotiations could lead to meaningful change or to betrayal. After much deliberation, he decided to accept the meeting, but on their terms. They chose a location known to both sides, a ruined fortress on the border of Freljord and Demacia. It was remote enough to discourage ambushes and symbolic of the border between worlds. Sylas sent back a response outlining their conditions. Both parties would come unarmed except for personal protection, and each side would bring equal numbers. They would also allow neutral observers from Ionia to attend, trusted mediators known for their impartiality. The chamberlain agreed. The days leading up to the parley were fraught with tension. The camp hummed with preparations. Some practiced speeches, others sharpened weapons just in case. Sylas spent hours alone, considering what concessions he could accept without betraying their cause. He knew the king would not dismantle Demacia's laws overnight. He needed to prioritize. The release of imprisoned mages was non-negotiable. So was the repeal of the law that made magic a crime. However, he could be flexible on the timeline, accepting gradual reforms if they came with guarantees. He also thought about the role of the mage seekers. Could they be transformed from hunters into protectors, trained to help mages control their powers rather than suppress them? These thoughts swirled in his mind like snow caught in wind. He consulted with advisors, with the Freljordian elders, and with the Ionian envoy, who had arrived as a mediator. Each offered insight. The elder spoke of patience and persistence, the envoy of harmony and balance, his comrades of justice and safety. Their voices helped him shape his approach. On the appointed day, Sylas and a small delegation set out. The journey to the ruins was quiet. Frost clung to the ground, crunching under boots. The Freljordian warriors who accompanied them had wrapped their weapons in cloth, leaving them in the care of those staying behind. Sylas wore his chains, though he resolved not to use them unless absolutely necessary. He thought of them as a symbol rather than a weapon this day, a reminder of what he fought to end. At the fortress, ivy crawled over crumbling stones, and birds nested in shattered battlements. It was a place that had seen battles long before their time. In the courtyard, a table had been set with simple benches. On one side sat the chamberlain and his advisors, stern-faced men and women in fine cloaks. On the other sat Sylas, Hap, the Freljordian envoy, and the Ionian mediator. Between them, the wind whispered through empty archways. The discussions began with formalities. The chamberlain expressed condolences for the lives lost on both sides and reaffirmed the new king's desire for peace. Sylas responded by acknowledging the king's efforts to ease tax burdens and the possibility of reform. They then moved into the heart of the matter. Sylas presented the rebels' demands again, speaking slowly, clearly, leaving no room for misinterpretation. The chamberlain countered with concerns about public safety, about the fear that unregulated magic could wreak havoc. Sylas countered with examples of mages who had healed and protected, of the suffering caused by repression. The Ionian mediator interjected occasionally, guiding the conversation back from heated exchanges. The Freljordian envoy spoke of how their people managed magic, offering models that could inspire new systems. Hours passed. Voices rose and fell. At times, frustration threatened to dissolve the dialogue. But each time, Sylas forced himself to breathe, to remember the elders' lessons of patience. By dusk, they had reached tentative agreements. The king would begin releasing non-violent mages from prison in stages, starting with those with families. A committee, including rebel representatives, would be formed to review cases of those convicted under magic laws. The mage seekers would undergo retraining, with a new division created to help mages control their abilities, rather than hunt them. In exchange, the rebels would halt attacks on civilian infrastructure and allow Demacian soldiers safe passage through certain regions. These concessions were not enough to satisfy the most radical among the exiles, but they represented progress. Sylas weighed the choices. Each compromise meant lives spared in the short term and room to push further later. He signed the document outlining these agreements, his name forming dark lines on parchment. The chamberlain did the same. They sealed it with wax and the king's crest. As they rose, there was no handshake, no warmth. There was only the recognition of a shared desire to prevent further bloodshed. They departed, each side carrying a mix of hope and suspicion. News of the agreement spread quickly. In some quarters of Demacia, the response was outrage. Traditionalists decried the concessions as capitulation, claiming they would lead to chaos. Some mage seekers resigned in protest. Others accepted the changes, eager to shift from suppression to support. In the countryside, families of imprisoned mages wept with joy as loved ones returned. In the rebel camp, reactions were similarly mixed. Those who had yearned for immediate and total liberation felt betrayed. They accused Sylas of settling for half measures. Others saw the value in gaining legal status and safety for some, while continuing the fight for full equality. Sylas stood before them and explained his reasoning. He said that revolutions were often marathons rather than sprints. Each step forward made the next one possible. He assured them that they had not given up their ultimate goal. They had merely opened a door. His words calmed some, angered others, and reminded everyone of the complexity of change. That night, he sat by the fire, reading Luke's letter again, reminding himself of the people he fought for and of the path he had chosen. Chapter 16. Shadows Within. For a time, the parley brought a lull in open hostilities. The Mage Seeker raids decreased, and the process of releasing prisoners began. The first reunions were poignant. Children clung to mothers they had not seen in years. Husbands embraced wives whose absence had left holes in their homes. Sylas attended some of these gatherings, standing at a distance to give them privacy. He saw the light that relief cast into weary eyes. These scenes fueled his resolve to continue pushing for broader reforms. He also saw the jealousy and fear in the eyes of those whose loved ones were not yet freed. Every victory highlighted the work still undone. The release of a handful only underscored the thousands still shackled in dungeons. The newly freed had stories of poor conditions, of ill treatment, of magical abilities dulled by constant exposure to petricite. Their testimonies added urgency to the cause. The rebels documented these accounts, compiling evidence to present at future negotiations. They also broadcast them in whispered songs and spoken tales, spreading awareness beyond their immediate circle. Peace, however, is seldom without shadows. As the movement grew, so did its complexity. New leaders emerged, each with their own vision. Some advocated for integration, for working within the system to enact change. Others argued for continued resistance until the old order was completely dismantled. Among the latter were those who began to see violence as not just a means, but an end. They relished the power they wielded in battles and the fear they instilled in their enemies. One man in particular, a mage who could manipulate fire, began to gather followers. He spoke passionately of burning the capital to the ground, of punishing all who had benefited from the oppression. His words resonated with those who had lost everything. Sylas watched this development with concern. He remembered the elders' warning about anger consuming those who nurtured it. He knew that if the movement fragmented into factions driven by revenge, it could lose its moral compass and, ultimately, its support among the wider population. Tensions came to a head when this firebrand and his followers staged an unapproved attack on a convoy carrying supplies to a small town. The cart belonged to a neutral merchant, someone who had quietly supported the rebels by smuggling messages. In the assault, the merchant was killed, his goods destroyed. The act endangered the precarious alliances that Sylas had painstakingly built. When news reached the camp, outrage flared. Meetings were called, voices shouted. Some defended the attack, arguing that any action that weakened the crown was justified. Others, including Hap, condemned it. Sylas listened, his jaw tight. He knew he had to act. He summoned the fire mage to a meeting. In a tense confrontation, he explained that the movement could not afford indiscriminate violence. He pointed to the merchant's widow, whose tear-streaked face waited outside the tent. He said that her husband's death served no purpose but to sow fear among those who might have been allies. The fire mage scoffed, accusing Sylas of weakness and of betraying the cause. Sylas' chains remained at his side, unused, his voice calm but firm. He told the man, that if he could not abide by the group's principles, he was free to leave. The man left, taking a handful of followers with him. It was a bitter departure, a fracture that felt like a crack in the foundation of the rebellion. Sylas watched them go, his heart heavy. He knew that they might become a rogue element, one that could be used by the crown to justify harsher measures. He also knew that he could not control everyone. Leadership was not about absolute power, but about guiding and letting go when paths diverged. After they left, he called a meeting of all factions. He reiterated their principles, that they fought for freedom, not vengeance, that they would not replicate the cruelty they opposed, that they sought to build a society where people could live without fear. He invited anyone who disagreed to voice their concerns. The discussion was long and sometimes painful. People spoke of their anger, their grief, their impatience. Others spoke of the future they envisioned. By the end, a fragile consensus emerged. They would continue to push for reforms, and they would defend themselves when attacked, but they would not strike at those who were not part of the oppressive apparatus. In the nights that followed, Sylas found himself lying awake more often, staring at the stars, feeling the weight of each decision. He considered the possibility that some level of fragmentation was inevitable, a movement that aimed to change the very fabric of society would always contain varied visions. He remembered the Freljord, where tribes pursued their own paths, yet united when necessary. He decided to formalize a council within the rebellion, comprising representatives from the different factions. This council would meet regularly, discuss strategy, and vote on major actions. It would not eliminate dissent, but it would give structure to it. It would also prevent any one person, including Sylas, from wielding unchecked influence. The idea was greeted with relief by some and skepticism by others. Nonetheless, it was implemented. Over time, it proved effective. It allowed for debate and for decisions that reflected a collective will. Sylas saw in this the seeds of the governance they hoped to build after the struggle. He smiled to himself, thinking that perhaps the process of fighting for freedom was also teaching them how to live it. Chapter 17. A meeting in twilight. As summer's heat softened into autumn's cool, a rumor reached Sylas that Lux had been seen in the gardens of a monastery near the capital, a place where some of the newly freed mages had taken refuge. His heart leaped and then steadied. He knew the dangers of meeting her. He had no wish to draw attention to her or to compromise the fragile peace. Yet the thought of seeing her, of speaking without parchment and intermediaries, tugged at him. He remembered the sound of her laughter echoing through the gloom of his cell. He remembered the books she had slid under his door, the warmth of her presence. He decided that if the opportunity presented itself, he would go, but only with utmost caution. He told no one but Hap, who understood and agreed to accompany him at a distance to ensure he could intervene if necessary. They travelled under the cover of night, cloaks pulled tight, blending into shadows. The monastery sat on a hill, its walls covered in ivy, its bell tower reaching toward the stars. It was said to be a place of contemplation and healing, away from the politics of the city. Sylas and Hap approached from the back, slipping through orchards, heavy with fruit. They waited among the trees until they saw a figure in a pale cloak, walking along a path lined with lanterns. Her hair, golden even in the dim light, gave her away. Sylas stepped from the shadows, his heart pounding. Luck stopped, her eyes widening. For a moment, they simply looked at each other, the years and distance collapsing. Then she smiled, and the tension eased like a held breath released. Their conversation was hushed, the words soft and weighty. Lux told him of her life since his escape. Her family had tightened their grip, fearful both for her and of her. She had been kept from the front lines, but had worked quietly to soften the hearts of those around her. She had used her position to influence the king, pushing him toward the reforms now taking shape. She confessed that she still struggled to reconcile her love for her country with her horror at its injustices. Sylas listened, seeing the strain in her posture. He told her of the rebellion's growth, of the sacrifices made, of the negotiations. He spoke of the fractures within the movement, and of his efforts to keep it aligned with its ideals. He told her of the Freljord, and the lessons he had learned from Sejuani and the elders. He shared his fears and his hopes. They found common ground in their desire for a future where magic wasn't feared but understood, where people were judged not for their gifts, but for their choices. Lux reached out and placed her hand on his forearm where the chains rested. The gesture echoed the touch that had freed him years before. She said that she admired his resolve and that she believed in the possibility of change. She also warned him that there were those in the court who saw the rebellion as an opportunity to consolidate power, who would sabotage reforms if it suited. She urged him to stay vigilant. Sylas nodded, grateful for her insight. He asked about Garen. Lux's eyes softened. She said that her brother was torn, that he loved his family and his country, but that the encounter with Sylas had shaken him. He had begun to question quietly the absolute nature of the laws he upheld. He was not yet ready to speak openly, but there was a crack in his certainty. Sylas felt both hope and sadness. He wished there had been a way to reach Garen without bloodshed. He promised Lux that he would do everything in his power to minimize harm, but he could not promise a bloodless path. She understood. They spoke until the moon was high. Hap remained at a distance, watching, ready to intervene if needed. When it was time to part, Lux squeezed Sylas' hand once more. She told him to take care of himself, and he told her the same. They knew that their paths would likely diverge again, pulled by the responsibilities they each bore. They also knew that their connection would endure, a thread of light between two opposing sides. Sylas melted back into the shadows, heart heavy and light at once. Hap joined him, and they slipped away into the night. As they walked, Sylas felt a renewed sense of purpose. He had seen with his own eyes that those within the system could change. He had felt the warmth of a friend who believed in him. This buoyed him against the storms yet to come. Chapter 18. Under the Walls. The respite afforded by negotiations could not last forever. Hardliners in the Demacian court, frustrated by the concessions made, began to maneuver to reclaim control. They lobbied the king to halt further releases and to authorize a decisive strike against the rebel strongholds. Intelligence reached Sylas that a massive force was being assembled. Not just mage seekers, but also regular army units, siege engineers, and petricite specialists. The target was clear, the canyon camp that had become the heart of the rebellion. Sylas convened the council. There were two options: stand and fight, risking annihilation, or abandon the camp and retreat into smaller, more mobile units. The decision was agonizing. The camp was more than a strategic location. It was a symbol. It had been built with sweat and hope. Leaving it felt like surrendering a piece of their identity, but staying could mean total destruction. After long debate, they chose a third path. They would defend the camp while simultaneously preparing an escape. They would also take the fight to the walls of the capital in a way that did not require direct assault, a demonstration of vulnerability aimed at forcing the king back to the negotiating table. Preparation for the defense was intense. They built barricades, dug trenches, and set traps. They sent non-combatants, including children and the elderly, to safe locations in the forest. Freljordian warriors positioned themselves at key points, ready to unleash frost magic to slow advancing troops. Ionian mages prepared wards that could misdirect enemy senses. Sylas and a small team began work on a bold plan to sabotage the petricite walls of the capital. Through research and experimentation, they had discovered that certain vibrations could disrupt the stone's absorption properties. If they could create a resonance strong enough, they might neutralize a portion of the wall, rendering it useless as a magical dampener. They hoped that such a demonstration would force the crown to reconsider an all-out assault. They also knew that the attempt could fail, or worse, cause unintended harm. They weighed the risks and decided that the potential gain was worth it. The night before the planned operation, Sylas walked the camp. Fires burned low, casting soft glows on faces lined with fatigue and resolve. He spoke with guards, thanked them for their vigilance, and offered words of encouragement. He paused at the hut where Hap slept and saw the young man staring up at the stars. They exchanged a smile, a silent acknowledgement of the journey they had taken together. Sylas then moved to a secluded spot and took out the amulet given to him by the Freljordian elder. He pressed it to his chest, feeling the cold of the ice that never melted. He whispered a prayer, something he had not done since childhood, asking for strength, wisdom, and the safety of those he led. The wind responded with a gentle sigh. He slept briefly, his dreams a swirl of snow and stone, of voices urging caution and courage. At dawn, the siege began. Horns blared, drums beat, and the ground shook as Demacian forces approached. Siege engines rolled forward, their wheels crushing underbrush. Sylas stood atop a ridge, watching the gleam of armor and the organized lines of troops. He lifted his chains, feeling the weight of responsibility. The first volleys of arrows flew from both sides. Freljordian magic turned the ground to slick ice under the advancing soldiers, causing them to slip and fall. Ionian wards deflected bolts of light, sending them harmlessly into the sky. Sylas moved along the line, reinforcing where needed, absorbing and redirecting magic as he had so many times before. The battle was fierce. The rebel camp's defenses held, but only just. They were outnumbered, and the relentless push of trained soldiers threatened to overwhelm them. Casualties mounted on both sides. Smoke rose, mingling with the morning mist. Meanwhile, the sabotage team crept toward the capital under cover of chaos. They moved through hidden paths, guided by sympathetic villagers and cloaked by enchantments. Their destination was a section of the petricite wall, known to be less monitored. They carried with them devices constructed from knowledge gleaned from Piltover and Ionia metal rods that could produce vibrations when struck in sequence. Upon reaching the wall, they placed the rods at precise intervals, then retreated to a safe distance. They struck the rods, one by one, following the pattern designed to create resonance. The sound traveled through the stone, low at first, then building. Within minutes, the section of wall began to hum. Guards atop the ramparts looked around, confused. The petricite surface shimmered. Then, with a crack like thunder, hairline fractures appeared. A portion of the wall crumbled, the stone losing its magical properties. No one was harmed, but the message was clear. The rebels could touch even the heart of Demacia's defenses. They left a banner in the rubble, a chain broken, a promise of change. The attack on the wall achieved its purpose. As news of the breach reached the king, he ordered the assault on the canyon to halt. He could not risk further erosion of the city's defenses. He summoned his generals and advisors, demanding explanations and solutions. The court divided. Some called for negotiation, others for a doubling down on force. In the camp, Sylas watched as the Demacian troops began to withdraw. A cheer rose, but it was subdued. They had survived, but at great cost. The dead were laid out, their faces peaceful in repose. The wounded groaned, tended by healers whose hands glowed softly. Sylas moved among them, offering comfort, making promises he hoped to keep. He knew that the reprieve was temporary. The king would not ignore the breach, but the demonstration of vulnerability had bought them time and leverage. It had shown that the rebellion was not a rabble, but a force capable of strategic, targeted action. Chapter 19. Winter's Return. With winter approaching, Sejuani and her warriors returned to the Freljord, needing to defend their own lands from rival tribes and marauding beasts. She promised to send aid again in the spring if the fight continued. Sylas bid them farewell, grateful for their solidarity. The camp settled into a rhythm of repair and preparation. They rebuilt defenses, tended to the wounded, and mourned the lost. The council continued to meet, debating next steps. The successful sabotage of the petricite wall had shifted the balance. The king had been forced to recognize the rebels' power and perhaps the futility of endless war. Yet, there were still many in Demacia who feared magic and who saw the rebellion as an existential threat. The coming months would be crucial. As snow began to fall, the response from the court arrived. It contained both chastisement and concession. The king condemned the attack on the wall as reckless and dangerous, but acknowledged that the laws needed reform. He proposed an expanded council including members from the rebellion, the mage seekers, and the nobility to draft new legislation. The timeline for releasing imprisoned mages was accelerated. Training programs for mage seekers shifted focus from suppression to support. These were significant steps. Still, they did not include full amnesty or the dissolution of the existing order. Sylas weighed the offer with the council. Some argued that it was enough to declare victory. Others insisted that they could not rest until every law that criminalized magic was erased. The debate was fierce, reflecting the tension between pragmatism and idealism that had always defined the movement. As they deliberated, winter storms raged outside. Tents strained under the weight of snow. Fires burned low, smoke curling into the dark sky. Supplies ran thin. The hardship of the season reminded them of the hardships their people had endured for generations. Sylas listened to voices on both sides of the argument. He thought of the lives saved by the partial reforms and of the lives still at risk if they pushed too hard. He thought of Luck's warning about those in the court who sought to use the rebellion for their own ends. He thought of the splinter group that had left, now rumored to be causing havoc in villages, undermining the movement's reputation. He thought of the Freljord, of the balance between strength and humility he had learned there. Ultimately, he concluded that they would accept the king's proposal with conditions. They would join the council and work toward legal reforms from within, while retaining the ability to withdraw if progress stalled or if bad faith became evident. The announcement of this decision caused relief and anger in equal measure. Hap and the majority supported it, seeing the benefits. Those who disagreed voiced their dissent, but did not leave. They agreed to watch, to see if change could indeed come through dialogue. The newly formed council began its work in early spring. Sylas travelled to the capital under escort, passing through gates he had once viewed only from within a wagon headed to the dungeon. The city looked different from the outside. He saw stalls with foods he had not tasted in years, children playing without fear, nobles riding horses adorned with jewels. He also saw beggars in doorways, faces thin with hunger, soldiers marching with expressions of duty and exhaustion. The layers of society were more visible to him now. He met with the council in a grand hall with high ceilings and stained glass windows depicting Demacia's history. The discussions were civil but charged. The mage seekers defended their purpose but acknowledged abuses. Nobles defended tradition but conceded that fear had driven excess. Rebels spoke of their experiences, grounding the conversation in human stories rather than abstractions. Progress was slow, but it was progress. During breaks, Sylas walked the corridors of the palace. He passed guards who eyed him warily and servants who whispered behind their hands. He saw Lux once briefly in a corridor lined with tapestries. They could not speak, but she gave him a small nod. He returned it, their silent communication a thread of connection in the labyrinth of politics. At night, he stayed in guest quarters with windows overlooking the city. He stared out at the lights, thinking of his parents in Dregbourne, of the undercity that had been his world. He wondered what they thought of him now. He hoped they knew that he fought not for glory, but for them, for those who had been voiceless. He also thought of the weight of compromise. Each concession made a difference to someone. Each line of text in the new laws represented hours of negotiation, of persuasion. Chapter 20. Laws written and unwritten months turned into a year. The council's work bore fruit. Demacia's legal code was rewritten to remove blanket prohibitions on magic. Instead, it established a licensing system, requiring mages to register and undergo training. While this was far from ideal, to some registration could become a tool for control. It marked a radical shift from criminalization. The mage seekers were restructured into a new order called the Mage Guard. Their mandate was to help mages master their abilities and to intervene only when magic was used to harm. Petriseed walls were to be supplemented with academies where scholars could study magic openly. Funding was allocated to support families of those unjustly imprisoned. Reparations were discussed, though the sums proposed could never compensate fully for years lost and trauma inflicted. As these changes rolled out, there were bumps. Some communities resisted the establishment of training centers. Others welcomed them. The process of enrolling mages was uneven, with some fearing to put their names on a list. Sylas and his allies worked to ensure that these lists would not become tools of persecution, pushing for oversight by mixed committees. In the midst of legal reform, cultural shifts began. People spoke more openly about their abilities. Children who had hidden sparks in their fingertips were now encouraged to attend classes. Art and music infused with magic appeared in market squares. Healers no longer risked arrest for using spells to mend bones. Stories of horror from the past were told in public, not whispered in fear. These stories served both as catharsis and as caution. They reminded citizens of what had been and what must not be again. Resistance persisted. Some nobles refused to allow mages on their lands. In these places, conflict flared. The splinter group led by the fire mage exploited these tensions, attacking those who cooperated with the new order. Sylas condemned these acts, working with the mage god to protect innocents. The former adversaries found themselves on the same side, fighting against extremism from within the rebellion's own ranks. As the first year of reforms concluded, Demacia was a different place. It was not yet the utopia some had envisioned. Inequities remained. Prejudices lingered. But the fear that had once suffocated mages had lifted somewhat. Sylas walked through Dregbourne without a hood, chains visible, and people greeted him with nods of respect. He visited his parents again, this time without secrecy. They embraced him in their doorway, tears streaming. He introduced them to Hap, now a confident young leader. He took them to see the new academy being built on the edge of the district. Children's laughter echoed through scaffolding as they learned to conjure light in controlled bursts. His parents listened to them, eyes shining. They said that although they never thought they would see such a day, they were glad they had lived long enough to witness it. Sylas' throat tightened. He knelt and placed his forehead to the floor in gratitude. In the palace, a statue of the sculptor Duran had been moved to make space for a new monument. A simple chain, broken, set upon a pedestal. It was a subtle tribute to the movement that had pushed the kingdom to change. It was not a grand monument with names etched in gold, but it was a start. As he stood before it, Sylas thought of all those who had not lived to see this day. He whispered their names. He also thought of those who still suffered elsewhere in the world. He remembered stories of Shuriman slaves bound to ancient rituals, of Noxian experiments on unwilling subjects, of Ionians caught between conflicting ideologies. He knew that while Demacia had taken steps, the larger world remained fraught. He resolved to use the experience gained here to support others when he could. He did not aspire to be a savior. He simply wanted to ensure that the lessons learned did not end at the borders of his homeland. Chapter 21. The way to freedom change, even when desired, brings its own burdens. As the legal and social reforms took hold, many mages found themselves navigating newfound freedom with uncertainty. Some had spent decades suppressing their abilities. Releasing them was both liberating and frightening. Accidents happened. Buildings were scorched by uncontrolled flares. Crops were frozen by bursts of cold. The Mage Guard responded with training and assistance rather than punishment. Still, the incidents fed fear among some non-magic citizens who called for stricter oversight. Sylas found himself mediating between frustrated communities and nervous mages. He encouraged patience and empathy on both sides. He reminded people that adjustment would take time and that missteps were part of learning. He also worked with the Mage Guard to create rapid response teams who could help contain magical accidents safely. Within the rebellion, a new question emerged. What was their role now? Their original goal had been to dismantle oppressive laws. Those laws had been rewritten. There was still work to be done, but it was different work. Some members, particularly those who had joined for the thrill of conflict, felt unmoored. Others saw an opportunity to help shape the future. The council decided to transform itself into a civic organization focused on education, mutual aid, and political engagement. They established schools in rural areas where mages and non-mages could learn together. They created apprenticeship programs that paired those with magical talents with artisans and healers. They organized community forums where people could discuss concerns and propose solutions. In this way, the spirit of resistance evolved into a spirit of participation. Sylas welcomed this shift. He had never desired endless war. He wanted a life where people could pursue their passions without fear. He threw himself into this new work, traveling from town to town, listening, teaching, advocating. Garen visited him one day. The meeting was arranged quietly, without fanfare. They met in a modest hall in Dregbourne, surrounded by wooden benches. Garen wore simpler attire than Sylas had ever seen on him. His expression was serious, his eyes tired. He spoke first, acknowledging the pain their conflict had caused. He admitted that he had been raised to believe that order must be preserved at all costs, and that he had not understood the depth of suffering inflicted by the laws he enforced. He said that Lux had helped him see differently. He thanked Sylas for challenging him, even when it had hurt. Sylas listened, his posture relaxed but alert. He thanked Garen for coming, for listening now. He said that he had seen the weight of responsibility on Garen's shoulders, that he understood the complexity of loyalty. They spoke for hours, sometimes in agreement, sometimes in heated debate. By the end, they had not resolved all differences, but they had found respect. Garen pledged to support the new laws and to use his influence to ensure they were implemented fairly. Sylas pledged to work with the Mage Guard to prevent abuses. They shook hands, the gesture carrying centuries of unspoken history. As the second year of reform drew to a close, festivals were held across Demacia. The sun shone on parades where mages and non-mages walked side by side. Banners of new colors fluttered: white for hope, blue for harmony, gold for courage. Music filled the air. Children wove spells into ribbons, creating patterns that delighted and amazed. Elderly men and women sat on benches watching, tears glistening. Sylas stood among them, his chains still around his forearms, not because he needed them, but because they were part of his story. A child approached him and asked to touch them. He knelt, allowing the small hands to feel the cool metal. The child giggled and said they felt heavy. Sylas smiled and replied that sometimes heavy things helped us remember important lessons. The child ran off, and Sylas stood, feeling the weight lighten. Chapter 22. A Quiet Return. As the years passed, Sylas found himself drawn to quieter pursuits. He had fought, negotiated, built and taught. He had seen the worst and the best of people. He had carried chains and broken them. He had lived in the shadows and stepped into the light. There was a part of him that longed for rest, not just for himself, but for those who had fought alongside him. One autumn day, he returned to the Mage Seeker compound, where he had been held for 15 years. It had been repurposed into a school and research center. The cold corridors were now lined with tapestries and shelves of books. The cells had been converted into classrooms. Children's laughter echoed off the stone walls that had once witnessed only tears. Sylas walked slowly, his hand trailing along the rough surface. He paused at the door of his old cell. It stood open now, sunlight streaming in through a window cut in the wall. He stepped inside. The room felt smaller than he remembered. The petricite shackles had been removed, replaced by a table covered with drawings of magical theory. He sat on the floor, cross-legged, closing his eyes. He breathed in deeply. The air smelled of ink and chalk. Memories flooded him, the dampness, the darkness, the sound of dripping water. He saw his younger self, thin, angry, desperate. He saw Lux, her face lit by candlelight. He saw the first book he had read, the words that had opened his mind. He saw the moment when the chains had cracked, when light had exploded in his hands. He saw the faces of those he had lost and of those he had freed. Tears welled up unbidden and spilled down his cheeks. They were not tears of sorrow alone. They were also of relief, of gratitude, of acknowledgement. He whispered a thank you to the space that had both confined and transformed him. He stood, took one last look, and stepped out. He closed the door gently behind him, not to lock it, but as a gesture of completion. He left the compound, walking into the golden light of afternoon. He wandered through the city. He saw old men playing dice in alleys, now without fear of raids. He saw young women practicing spells in parks, their friends cheering. He saw merchants haggling over prices, soldiers training with wooden swords, scholars debating. Life was messy and vibrant. It was not perfect, but it was freer. He visited the market and bought a loaf of bread, savouring the simple act. He sat on a bench and watched the world go by. People recognized him and nodded. Some approached, thanking him. He smiled, humbled. He did not seek praise. He sought connection. He listened to their stories, offered advice when asked, and moved on. He carried with him the awareness that change was constant, that vigilance was necessary, but also that moments of peace should be savoured. He allowed himself to feel contentment. One evening, as the sun set and painted the sky in hues of pink and orange, Sylas climbed a hill overlooking Demacia. He sat on a flat stone, his chains coiled beside him. The wind rustled the grass. He thought of the journey that had brought him here. He thought of the boy in Dregbourne, the mage seeker, the prisoner, the fugitive, the rebel leader, the negotiator, the teacher. Each of those selves still lived within him. He also thought of those who had shared the path. Lux with her light, Sejuani with her strength, Hap with his growth, Garen with his conflict. He thought of the nameless mages who had whispered their hopes to him. He let their stories wash over him, a chorus of voices that blended into the sound of the wind. He closed his eyes, inhaled, and exhaled slowly. He whispered into the breeze a message, not of anger or demands, but of gratitude and hope. Sleepy summoner, as you listen to the wind in your own world, know that Sylas' journey was one of pain and liberation, of loss and learning, of chains broken and bonds formed. His story is not only his own. It belongs to all who seek freedom and who work to build a world where each person's light can shine. As night falls, let the slow cadence of his tale lull you. Let the images of snow and stone, of fire and frost, of friendship and struggle settle into your mind like gentle snowflakes. There will always be those who seek to shackle and those who strive to unshackle. May you always find the strength to stand on the side of freedom. Close your eyes now, sleepy summoner, and drift into dreams where chains are nothing more than stories, and hope is the hearth that warms your rest. Chapter 23. Teachings of Durand. In the quieter years that followed the great reforms, Sylas found time to delve deeply into the writings that had once inspired his escape. Among them were the treatises of Durand, the sculptor whose work had shaped Demacia and whose philosophies had paradoxically provided the key to dismantling its oppressive tools. Sylas had read fragments of Durand's work in his cell, but now he had access to the full corpus. He sat for hours in the library that had replaced the Mage Seeker archive, the scent of paper and leather filling his senses. He turned pages slowly, absorbing not only the technical details but also the reflections of a man who had understood the interplay between form and function, between beauty and power. Durand wrote of petricite as a living material, capable of absorbing not just magic but intent. He wrote of responsibility in crafting instruments of protection, warning against the temptation to use such instruments to dominate. These words, written decades before the oppression of mages reached its peak, resonated with Sylas. He wondered whether Durand had foreseen the path his creations would take. Sylas shared these texts with others. He gathered groups of apprentices, young mages and non-mages alike, and read aloud passages where Durand spoke of balance. He encouraged discussion. Some students were fascinated by the technical descriptions of carving and shaping stone. They asked questions about hardness and resonance, about why petricite absorbed magic while other stones did not. Others were drawn to the philosophical musings. They debated the ethics of creating tools that could be used for good or ill. Sylas listened, offering insights when appropriate, but also allowing the conversation to flow organically. He wanted them to think critically, to see that knowledge was not static but alive. Through these sessions, he hoped to instill in them the understanding that every action they took, every tool they created or used, carried with it a responsibility to consider its impact on others. Durand's lessons were not just about stone, they were about society. The study of petricite also led to innovations. Students experimented with small pieces of the stone, testing its limits. They discovered that when ground into powder and mixed with certain resins, it could form flexible sheets that dampen magic without completely blocking it. These sheets were used to line boxes for transporting magical herbs safely, and to create gloves for healers whose touch sometimes released uncontrollable bursts. Other students found that by layering petricite with metal, they could create instruments that resonated at specific frequencies, useful for tuning magical instruments and for therapy for those whose abilities were unstable. Sylas watched these experiments with pride. The stone that had once bound him was now being transformed into tools that aided people. The shift from suppression to support was tangible. He wrote to Sejuani, describing the discoveries. She responded with news of her own experiments with ice and stone in the Freljord. The exchange of knowledge bridged lands and cultures. In his personal reflections, Sylas considered the parallels between carving stone and shaping society. Both required patience. One could not simply hack away at petricite and expect a masterpiece. One had to study the grain, to understand how the stone wanted to break. Similarly, laws and institutions could not be changed by force alone. They required careful consideration of how people thought and lived. Change came from conversation, from education, from gradual shifts in perception as much as from decisive action. He wrote essays of his own, tracing his journey and the lessons he had learned. weaving in Durand's teachings. He published them under his name, not to gain fame but to contribute to a growing body of knowledge. Readers responded, some with praise, others with critique. Sylas welcomed both. He saw in the discourse the health of a society that had learned to debate without fear of repression. Chapter 24. Voices of the Undercity. The transformation of Demacia was not uniform. In the gilded halls of nobility, changes were noted in statutes and ceremonies. In the Undercity, where Sylas had been born, change was felt in daily life. He spent time walking those alleys, listening to the voices of his people. In a small bakery, a woman named Marta spoke of how her daughter had revealed the ability to make dough rise faster by warming it with her hands. In the past, this would have been hidden. Now, the girl was encouraged to attend the local academy. Marta's eyes shone as she described her daughter's excitement at learning spells alongside multiplication tables. In another house, an elderly man named Tovin recounted how he had spent years hiding his ability to mend broken pottery with a whisper. He had feared being dragged away. Now, he sat in front of his home, mending neighbors' cups and bowls openly. His fingers were cracked, his face lined, but his smile was wide. Not all stories were so optimistic. In a cramped room above a tavern, a young man named Richter spoke with bitterness. He had lost his brother to the mage seekers years before. His brother had died in prison, never benefiting from the reforms. Richter asked why the current generation should be satisfied with partial justice when so many had suffered irreversibly. Sylas listened, the weight of the question settling on his shoulders. He acknowledged the injustice. He explained the steps being taken to compensate families and the efforts to ensure transparency in the new system. He admitted that no amount of policy could undo the past. He asked Richter what he needed to heal. The young man looked away, tears glistening. He said he needed his brother back. Sylas could not provide that. He could only promise to continue working to prevent such losses. Richter nodded reluctantly. The conversation ended not with resolution, but with a shared understanding of pain. In the market, a group of teenagers gathered around a storyteller. The man, with a voice like sandpaper and eyes like coal, recited tales of the rebellion. He spoke of Sylas as a mythic figure who had broken his chains with lightning and who wielded fire and ice with equal ease. Sylas, standing at the edge of the crowd, smiled wryly. The storyteller embellished freely, turning battles into epics and decisions into proclamations. Children gasped and clapped, their imaginations inflamed. Sylas considered stepping forward to correct the exaggerations, then decided against it. Myths had their place. They inspired and taught lessons, even if they strayed from factual accuracy. He did, however, approach the storyteller afterward and gently suggested weaving in stories of ordinary people, the bakers, the potters, the farmers whose quiet acts of courage had been just as vital. The man nodded thoughtfully, promising to adjust his tales. The Undercity's oral tradition would thus reflect a more nuanced history, one that honored all contributors. Chapter 25. Beyond Demacia. With Demacia on a path to greater inclusivity, Sylas' attention turned outward. He remembered the letters he had sent to Ionia and Piltover during the rebellion. He decided to travel, to see what lessons could be shared and learned. His first journey took him east to Piltover, the city of progress. He arrived by caravan, chains wrapped under his cloak. eyes wide at the sight of tall, gleaming towers connected by bridges and tubes through which glided capsules of goods and people. Piltover buzzed with invention. Artificers and Hextech engineers worked side by side. Magic was integrated into technology openly, regulated not by fear, but by guilds and market forces. Sylas met with scholars who described how they balanced innovation with safety. They had strict codes, enforced by councils composed of mages, scientists, and civic leaders. When accidents occurred, as they inevitably did, reviews were public and solutions were debated. Sylas listened, fascinated. He saw elements that could inform further reforms in Demacia, particularly regarding transparency and accountability. He also visited the city's underbelly zone. There he saw the consequences of unregulated experimentation. Pollution that choked canals, workers coughing up fumes. In dimly lit labs, young inventors pushed boundaries without oversight, driven by necessity and ambition. Magic-infused chemicals bubbled in vats, releasing fumes that altered minds. Sylas spoke with a group of chem barons who controlled large swaths of Zon. They talked of opportunity, of providing jobs for those overlooked by Piltover, of the perils of regulation stifling innovation. Sylas saw their point, but also saw the cost. Children worked near toxic vats. Accidents were frequent. He considered how Demacia might avoid such extremes. Freedom needed guardrails. The challenge was finding the balance between restricting harm and encouraging growth. He took copious notes, planning to share his observations with the Mage Guard and the Council upon his return. From Piltover, he travelled to Ionia, a land of harmony and conflict. He walked through forests that resonated with spiritual energy, where each tree seemed to breathe. He met monks who meditated by waterfalls, their faces serene, their hands sparking with controlled energy. They spoke of balance and of magic as a natural extension of life. They welcomed him, understanding the burden he carried. They taught him breathing techniques to calm his mind and exercises to ground his energy. They introduced him to scholars who studied the interplay between magic and emotion. He learned that magic could be fueled by anger or love, by fear or joy, and that understanding the source could help control it. These lessons echoed the elders' teachings in the Freljord. He also witnessed the scars of war villages still rebuilding after Noxian invasions, people wary of outsiders. Ionia, like Demacia, struggled to reconcile its ideals with its realities. In each place, Sylas shared his story. He spoke to assemblies in Piltover, to councils in Ionia, to street gatherings in Zon. He described the transformation of Demacia, not as a blueprint, but as an example of what could happen when people demanded change and were willing to work for it. He listened to their stories, understanding that each region required solutions tailored to its history and culture. He offered solidarity, not prescriptions. He invited scholars and artisans to visit Demacia and to participate in the exchanges. Some accepted eagerly, others were cautious. By the time he returned home, his mind was full of ideas and his heart heavy with the knowledge that oppression and injustice were not confined to his homeland. There was so much work to be done, but there was also hope. People everywhere, regardless of origin, shared a desire for dignity and fairness. That commonality was a thread he would continue to weave. Chapter 26. Ice and Memory. Years after his initial journey to the Freljord, Sylas returned, not as a supplicant seeking aid, but as a friend. He travelled with a small group, his chain still wrapped, his steps familiar. The journey over the mountains was less daunting this time. He knew the rhythms of the land, the places where snow drifted deep, the caves that offered shelter. Sejuani greeted him with a bear's hug, her laugh echoing across the camp. Her hair was streaked with more white, and her eyes carried the same fire. The winter's claw had thrived. They had repelled invasions, negotiated truces, and hunted beasts. They had also adopted some of Demacia's innovations, petricite-infused tools that helped manage magic in new ways. In turn, they had shared with Demacia strategies for communal living and decision-making. The exchange had enriched both peoples. During his visit, Sylas participated in a midwinter festival. The tribe gathered around a massive bonfire that crackled and roared, sparks spiraling into the night. The auroras danced overhead, ribbons of green and purple weaving across the dark canvas. Drums beat in complex rhythms, and voices rose in chants that had been sung for generations. Sejuani led a ceremony honoring ancestors, pouring melted snow onto the ground and speaking their names. When it was Sylas' turn, he stepped forward and spoke the names of those he had lost: his mentor, the healer, the child, comrades from the rebellion. His voice trembled, but the tribe responded with a low hum of support. The act of speaking their names into the cold air felt like releasing them and honoring them at once. Tears froze on his cheeks. He felt the weight of memory lighten, replaced by a sense of connection to the land and its people. He spent afternoons with the elder who had taught him about the spirits. They sat by a frozen lake, watching fish dart under the ice. She asked him about the reforms and listened quietly as he spoke. She nodded at his frustrations and chuckled at his descriptions of bureaucratic debates. She told him that change was like the seasons. It would come, sometimes in sudden storms, sometimes in slow melts. One could not force spring to arrive, but one could prepare the ground. She handed him a carved piece of ice similar to the amulet she had given before. It held a tiny air bubble that moved when he tilted it. She said that it represented adaptability, the ability to shift with circumstances while maintaining inner clarity. He accepted it gratefully. Such reminders were vital. He also participated in hunts and training sessions. He rode tusk lords, feeling the familiar thrill. He sparred with warriors, learning new techniques and sharing some of his own. They laughed when he stumbled and cheered when he succeeded. Around the fire they told stories of their exploits. They teased him about Demacian food being too bland and asked when he would bring more wine from the south. He promised to return with barrels. They promised to send smoked meat. The exchange felt like family banter, comfortable and affectionate. As he prepared to leave, Sejuani walked with him to the edge of camp. She placed a hand on his shoulder and told him that the world would always need those willing to break chains, but it would also need those willing to mend them. He nodded, her words sinking deep. Chapter 27. Letters to the Self. As time flowed, Sylas took up the habit of writing letters not to others, but to himself. He treated them as conversations with his past and future selves. In one letter, he addressed the boy who had turned himself in to the mage seekers. He wrote of innocence and trust, of how that trust had been exploited, and of how important it was to question authority. He offered comfort, telling his younger self that ignorance was not a crime, and that he had acted out of love for his parents. He assured him that despite the pain ahead, he would find allies and purpose. In another letter, he wrote to the prisoner who had sat in darkness for 15 years. He acknowledged the anger and despair that had suffocated him. He thanked him for not letting that despair consume him, for allowing curiosity to survive. He described the taste of freedom and the feel of sun on skin. He promised that the years of isolation would one day be counterbalanced by years of connection. He wrote to the fugitive who had escaped with chains around his wrists. He recounted the fear that had chased him through alleys and forests. He commended his courage and his mistakes, for both had shaped him. He wrote to the rebel leader who had made difficult choices, who had been lauded and vilified. He thanked him for listening to advisors, for admitting mistakes, for holding on to principles. He reminded him that leadership was not about being perfect, but about being honest. He wrote to the negotiator who had sat at tables with those who had once imprisoned him. He praised his patience and his ability to see the humanity in opponents. He acknowledged the compromises that still haunted him and reassured him that incremental change was still change. Finally, he wrote to his future self, the man he would be years hence. He hoped that he would remain open to learning, that he would not let comfort breed complacency, that he would continue to challenge injustice wherever he found it. These letters were never meant to be read by others. They were mirrors. They allowed Sylas to process emotions and to mark growth. They also served as a record of his journey, valuable should memory fade. Hap once caught a glimpse of one of the pages and asked what it was. Sylas smiled and explained the practice. Hap laughed and said it sounded like talking to oneself. Sylas agreed, adding that sometimes the most important conversations were those we had internally. Hap asked if he could try. Sylas encouraged him. Days later, Hap handed him a letter addressed to his younger self, the boy who had hesitated to kill. In it, Hap forgave himself and pledged to protect the vulnerable. Sylas read it with tears in his eyes. He realized that the practice could help others heal. He suggested it to those struggling with guilt or trauma. Slowly, it became part of their collective healing toolkit. Chapter 28. Final lights of the day. As the sun sets on this tale, sleepy summoner, know that stories do not truly end. They continue in the lives of those who hear them, in the decisions they influence, in the dreams they inspire. Sylas' journey from a boy in the Undercity to a leader, from a prisoner to a teacher, from anger to understanding, echoes across time. He walks still, sometimes through bustling markets, sometimes along quiet paths. He carries chains not as bindings but as reminders. He speaks softly to those he meets, listens deeply, and intervenes when injustice arises. He is older now. His hair has silver strands. His hands show lines. But his eyes remain bright. They carry the memories of snow on lashes, of the weight of stone, of the warmth of fireside debates. He stands again on the hill overlooking Demacia, much as he did years before. The city has grown. New towers rise, not as symbols of division, but as beacons of knowledge. The academy's spires glimmer in twilight. Freljordian tents dot the outskirts. Traders from Ionia set up stalls. Piltover's airships dock at new ports. The kingdom has become a crossroads. Children run with reckless joy, their laughter a river that flows through streets. Older couples walk hand in hand, marveling at the changes that have swept through their lifetimes. Sylas watches, heart swelling. He thinks of the letters he wrote, the battles he fought, the hands he held. He whispers gratitude to those who stood with him, to those who opposed him, and taught him patience. To those who came after and carried the torch, as the last light dips below the horizon, he feels a gentle tiredness, not the exhaustion of battle, but the contentment of a day well spent. He turns to you, sleepy summoner, and smiles. He thanks you for listening, for walking beside him in thought. He tells you that your own story matters just as much. He encourages you to find the chains you need to break and to recognize the bonds worth nurturing. He reminds you that change is possible, that justice can be pursued with compassion, that strength and gentleness can coexist. He invites you to rest now, to let his story settle like snow on a quiet night. Let the images of mountains and fires, of letters and laughter drift through your dreams. When you wake, may you carry with you a piece of his resilience and a spark of his hope. Good night, sleepy summoner. May your sleep be deep and your dreams filled with freedom. Chapter 29. Festival of Healing. The years that followed the great transformations in Demacia were ones of rebuilding and tending to wounds that were not always visible. The physical scars of battle could be seen in the rebuilt walls and repaired bridges, but there were deeper scars etched into the hearts of people who had been divided by fear. As seasons turned and harvests came and went, a group of healers from across the land proposed a festival dedicated to healing. They envisioned not a military parade or a grand procession of power, but a gathering where magic and tradition could interweave in gentle ways. They called upon Sylas, once a symbol of rebellion, to help shape the festival. He agreed, seeing in it an opportunity to nurture the reconciliation he had fought for. He spent days walking through villages, speaking with elders and artisans, inviting them to bring their customs. He asked the mage seekers, now transformed into protectors of balance, to participate as well, not as guards, but as companions. Some hesitated, still wary of those they'd once pursued. Others saw in this invitation a chance to heal their own hearts. The festival was held in a valley where a river wound through meadows. Trees in autumn colors lined the edges, their leaves a tapestry of gold and crimson. As people arrived, they set up tents that blended the architecture of different regions. There were Demacian tents with blue and white banners, Freljordian tents stitched from thick fur, Ionian silk tents shimmering in the light. Piltover inventors constructed small stages where performers could share stories. The air was filled with scents of spices, herbs, and fresh bread. Children chased each other with ribbons, weaving patterns in the air. Musicians tuned instruments of different origins, harps, drums, flutes, and strings. The river murmured, providing a constant, calming backdrop. At the heart of the festival was a circle of stones arranged by elders from various communities. The stones were not ancient relics, but newly carved pieces of petricite, smooth to the touch, each infused with a different symbol, an eye representing vigilance, a hand symbolizing care, a flame signifying transformation. People were invited to sit within the circle to share stories of loss and healing. There were no titles or ranks inside that circle. Farmers sat next to scholars, former mage seekers next to mages, nobles next to those once labeled outlaws. Sylas sat among them, listening. He heard a mother speak of hiding her child's magic and the fear that had haunted her. He heard a former soldier confess the guilt of carrying out orders that now felt cruel. He heard a young mage describe the relief of casting a spell openly for the first time. Each story was received with silent nods, with hands placed gently on shoulders, with tears and smiles. The act of listening became a kind of healing in itself. Throughout the festival, healers offered their skills. Some practiced traditional medicine, applying salves to wounds and setting bones. Others used magic carefully, coaxing warmth into stiff joints or calming anxious hearts. A pair of healers from the Freljord taught breathing techniques borrowed from their shamanic practices, guiding participants to focus on the rhythm of their breath. An Ionian elder led a meditation by the river, inviting people to imagine their emotions as leaves on the water, carried away and released. Sylas participated in these exercises, finding in them a reprieve from the constant planning and strategizing that had occupied much of his life. He found himself sitting in the river's shallow edge, letting cold water flow over his hands. He remembered the first time he had learned to feel magic beneath the surface of things, to listen rather than take. The festival rekindled that sense of patience. In another corner of the meadow, artisans from different cultures collaborated. A Demacian blacksmith and a Noxian carpenter built a structure that fused petricite with wood, creating a communal table where people could share meals. A Zornite engineer and a Piltover scientist designed lanterns powered by a harmless form of chemtech, casting soft light when the sun dipped. Children were invited to paint on large cloths, their handprints overlapping in a mosaic of color. Elders embroidered patterns that symbolized unity. These artistic expressions became physical manifestations of the healing taking place. They reminded Sylas of the murals he had seen in Piltover, where innovation and art intertwined. He marveled at how creativity could be a language understood across cultural boundaries. As evening fell, the festival shifted into a quieter mood. People gathered around fires, their faces illuminated by flickering flames. Musicians played gentle melodies. A bard began to tell a story of an ancient Demacian mage who had hidden her gift to protect her family, only to later discover that her magic could heal the land. The bard's voice was calm, slow, each word stretching like a comforting cloth. Sylas closed his eyes, letting the cadence lull him. He remembered his mother telling him stories when he was a child, her voice a constant even when food was scarce. He felt a softness in his chest, a tender ache for what had been lost and what had been regained. One part of the festival was dedicated to physical movement, not as sport, but as expression. Dancers from Ionia performed graceful movements that mimicked the flow of water and wind. Freljordian warriors demonstrated slow, deliberate forms used in their training, turning what was once martial into meditative. Sylas joined in a circle dance led by the children. They moved slowly, stepping in unison, hands joined. The movement was simple, accessible to anyone regardless of age. It was a dance of connection rather than performance. As they stepped, they sang a song created for the festival, its lyrics about rivers meeting the sea, about mountains greeting the sky. The song lingered in the air long after the dance ended. During a shared meal, Sylas sat with a group that included a former mage seeker named Roland. Roland had been part of the system that hunted mages. He had once chained Sylas. Now he sat across from him, his hands wrapped around a bowl of stew. He spoke haltingly, admitting that he still carried fear. He asked how to forgive himself. Sylas listened, then spoke gently of how change took time. That guilt could be a teacher if one did not let it consume. He told Roland that taking part in healing others was a way forward. They sat in silence for a time, watching steam rise. The moment held a quiet honesty. It was one of countless such interactions during the festival, each small and significant. As the festival drew to its conclusion, participants were invited to take a stone from the central circle, not to keep, but to place somewhere meaningful in their lives. The stones were meant to serve as reminders of their commitment to healing. Sylas took a stone engraved with a wave, representing adaptability. He planned to place it near the entrance to his home, where he would see it each day. Before he left the meadow, he stood at the river and spoke aloud the names of those who could not attend his parents, his mentor, the girl whose magic had first opened his eyes. He thanked them for guiding him and promised to continue working toward a world where children would not need to hide. He felt the river carry his words away. The festival did not erase pain or erase history. It could not undo the years of oppression, but it wove a new thread into the fabric of Demacia's story. It created a space where healing was not a private, hidden act, but a communal endeavor. It taught Sylas that gentleness could be as powerful as resistance. It reminded him that revolutions were not only fought with chains and declarations, but also with listening ears, open hands, and shared meals. When he returned to his daily life, the memory of the festival stayed with him. In moments of frustration, he remembered the warmth of the fires and the slow song of the dancers. In negotiations, he recalled Roland's questions and the patience required to answer them. The festival became a compass, pointing toward the kind of future he wanted to continue building. Chapter 30. Stories from the Outlands. Once the initial waves of change had settled in Demacia, Sylas felt a restless curiosity rise within him again. He had travelled to the Freljord and to Piltover, but there were other lands he had only heard of in whispers. Stories had always been a thread connecting distant places. As a child in the Undercity, Sylas had listened to sailors speak of sun-baked deserts and jungles that swallowed ruins. During his years in chains, he had imagined the places beyond stone walls. Now, with Demacia more open, and with responsibilities shared among trusted allies, he found time to journey beyond the boundaries he had once thought impenetrable. He did not travel as a conqueror or emissary. He traveled as a listener, a collector of stories. His first destination was Shurima, the vast desert kingdom to the south. He crossed rolling dunes that seemed endless. The sun was a relentless presence, pounding like a drum. At night, the temperature dropped, and stars spilled across the sky in such numbers that he felt as if he could scoop them up. He reached an oasis where merchants gathered to trade spice, silk, and ancient relics. There, he met a storyteller named Zia, who sat on a low cushion surrounded by clay lamps. Zia told him tales of ascended warriors who had once ruled Shurima, of gods walking among humans, of the rise and fall of an empire reborn. She spoke of the young emperor Azir, whose return had awakened memories long buried in sand. Her voice was rich, her hands painting pictures in the air. She described a city of golden towers emerging from the desert and of a people reclaiming their identity after centuries. Sylas listened, fascinated by the cyclic nature of history, how empires rose, fell, and sometimes rose again. He asked questions about the mages of Shurima, whether they faced persecution. Zia explained that magic there was woven into everyday life through rituals and relics. Though there were conflicts, the relationship between magic and society differed from Demacia's. The contrast broadened his understanding of what was possible. From Shurima, Sylas travelled west toward a region known as the Outlands, where borders blurred and cultures mingled. He reached a coastal village where waves crashed against black cliffs. The village was small, but its harbour bustled with ships from Bilgewater, Noxus, and beyond. He watched fishermen haul nets heavy with glittering fish, their voices raised in song. He met a retired sea captain named Illa, whose weathered hands moved as she described the serpent-filled waters around Bilgewater. She told him of creatures like the vast serpent Nagakaburos, and of pirates who revered a goddess of motion and change. She spoke of Iloi, a priestess who wielded a massive idol, challenging warriors to prove their spirits. Sylas marveled at the diversity of belief systems. He realized that magic could take forms beyond the raw power he had known. It could be embodied in traditions, rituals, and relationships with the unseen. He continued to wander along the coast and into forests that were thick with vines. He met a group of travelers from a hidden city called Ixtal. They were wary at first, their accents melodic, their clothing woven with iridescent fibers. They spoke of a civilization that had survived cataclysms by hiding within ancient jungles, preserving knowledge of elemental magic and alchemy. They showed him small devices that could purify water in seconds, powders that could make plants grow faster. They also spoke of isolation, of the fear that sharing their knowledge would lead to exploitation. Sylas recognized their caution. He understood the delicate balance between protecting one's people and engaging with the wider world. He told them of Demacia's journey. They listened, intrigued, but ultimately chose to keep their city secret. He respected their decision and felt humbled that they had trusted him even to that extent. In each place, Sylas collected not only stories but also lessons. He learned from a Shuriman herbalist how certain desert plants could soothe fever. He learned from a Bilgewater sailor how to read storm patterns by watching seabirds. He learned from an Ixtali scholar the theory behind controlling elemental energy in ways that did not harm the environment. He did not hoard these lessons. Instead, he shared them when he returned to Demacia, crediting those who had taught him. He encouraged exchanges, inviting those curious about